In the quiet dust of museum archives and the sterile clean rooms of university laboratories, there are clay tablets, thousands of them, etched with the tiny wedge-shaped script of ancient Sumer. They tell us of kings and floods, of beer recipes and legal disputes, yet some of them show something utterly baffling. They depict our solar system, but with a strange accuracy that feels impossible for a civilization that peered at the heavens with only the naked eye. A depiction that includes not just the planets visible to them, but celestial bodies like Uranus and Neptune, planets we didn't officially discover until the age of powerful telescopes. Even more curiously, they consistently include an extra planet, a 12th member of the solar family, if you count the sun and moon, a massive world they called Nibiru, the planet of the crossing. Historians and astronomers call these artistic conventions mythological representations, but the precision is unsettling, a quiet scientific mystery sleeping in baked clay. How could they possibly have known? The tablets offer their own answer, a story so vast and so strange that we have filed it away under the gentle heading of myth, a comfortable way of saying we don't have a better explanation. Tonight, we're going to pull that story from the shelf and tell it not as a myth, but as it was written, a history. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, I'd love to see where you're listening from tonight. Just drop your city or country and the local time in the comments below. It's always a comfort to know we're sharing this story across the quiet, sleeping face of the world. Our story begins not under the warm yellow sun of Earth, but in the deep, cool twilight of a world adrift. Imagine a planet, immense and ancient, moving not in a gentle, near-perfect circle as our Earth does, but on a vast, elliptical path that slingshots it out into the blackest depths of space for thousands of years, before bringing it sweeping back home through the inner solar system. This was Nibiru, a world of giants, both in its physical size and in the lifespan of its inhabitants, whose years were counted by the planet's own long, slow orbit, a single one of their years equaling 3,600 of ours. The beings who lived there were tall and pale, with features that were at once familiar and yet unsettlingly perfect. Their society, a towering achievement of science and order that had long ago conquered disease, war, and want. Yet for all their power, they were failing. Their world was dying, not with a bang, but with a slow, cold whisper. The source of their doom was the very orbit that defined their existence. Each long passage through the void, far from the life-giving warmth of the system's central star, was taking its toll. Their atmosphere, a complex and fragile shield engineered over millennia, was bleeding away into the vacuum, molecule by molecule. With every grand orbit, the shield grew thinner, the surface temperatures dropped, and the faint, reddish light of their distant sun seemed to lose more of its strength. The great, crystalline cities, marvels of architecture that blended seamlessly with the sculpted landscape, were now bathed in a perpetual crimson dusk. The air grew sharp and thin, and the people of Nibiru, the Anunnaki as they called themselves, had retreated into these climate-controlled environments, their world outside becoming a barren, windswept expanse of fading grandeur. At the apex of this ancient civilization sat the king, Anu. He was not a tyrant who ruled by force, but a custodian of a lineage so old It was intertwined with the very history of his race. He carried the weight of ages on his shoulders, his face a mask of serene exhaustion, presiding over a council of scientists and elders who brought him the same dire report year after year. The models were irrefutable. The atmospheric decay was accelerating. Within a few more orbits, a few more of their long millennia, their world would become incapable of supporting life. Their solutions had grown more and more desperate, but every attempt to patch the atmospheric shield had failed. There was, however, one last, fantastically ambitious hypothesis, a final roll of the dice. Their scientists believed that if they could acquire a vast quantity of a very specific element, gold, and pulverize it into a fine monatomic dust, they could suspend it in the highest reaches of their atmosphere. This glittering shield would, in theory, reflect what little light and heat reached them, stabilizing the climate and sealing the atmospheric leaks. It was a geoengineering project on an unimaginable scale, a last, desperate attempt to save a dying God King's world. The problem, of course, was that after eons of technological civilization, Nibiru's own gold reserves were almost completely exhausted. This is where the Council's attention turned from their own fading skies to the glittering star fields beyond. For generations, their automated probes had surveyed the other planets that shared their sun. One in particular stood out. As their homeworld began its long journey inward from the cold depths, their trajectory would carry them past a small, vibrant planet teeming with life, the seventh in their celestial count from the outer darkness. It was a jewel of brilliant blue and swirling white, rich in water, and their probes had confirmed, rich in the very gold they so desperately needed. They called this planet Kai, the ancient word for a solid foundation, but we know it by another name, Earth. The debate in Anu's High Council was tense, a quiet affair of minds that could process immense quantities of data in moments. To mount a mission across such a distance was a monumental undertaking. Even for them, it would require a new generation of spacecraft, a commitment of resources they could ill afford, and a crew willing to travel to a primitive, volatile world. Here, the central conflict of our story truly begins, embodied in Anu's two sons. The first was Enlil, the commander, the heir apparent. He was a being of immense discipline and authority, a pragmatist who saw the universe in terms of order, law, and logistics. To him, the mission to Earth was a mining operation, a problem to be solved with efficiency and control. His younger half-brother was Enki, a name that meant Lord of the Earth. He was a master scientist, a geneticist, and engineer of unparalleled genius. But he was also a maverick, driven by a boundless curiosity that often chafed against Enlil's rigid authority. Where Enlil saw resources to be extracted, Enki saw a world of wonders to be studied, a unique biological experiment he yearned to understand. The tension between them was more than sibling rivalry. It was a fundamental clash of philosophies, control versus curiosity, order versus creation. Their father, Anu, saw the strengths and dangers in both of them. The decision fell. A mission would be launched. The survival of Nibiru depended on it. But the question of who would lead and what their true purpose would be once they reached that distant blue world hung in the thin cold air of the throne room, pregnant with the fate of two worlds. The silence in Anu's great hall was heavy, a blanket of unspoken anxieties. The decree was made, A mission to the distant blue world would be the final desperate hope for their race. But the question of leadership remained a sharp point of contention between his two powerful sons. Enlil, ever the commander, argued that his place was on Nibiru, overseeing the grand strategy from the throne's right hand, a logistical puppeteer managing the vast flows of information and eventually resources. He was the heir, the administrator, and his authority, he maintained, must remain centralized. Enki, whose brilliant mind had conceived of the mission's technical aspects and whose heart beat with a scientist's insatiable curiosity, argued just as fiercely that he must lead the expedition on the ground. He was the only one who truly understood the complexities of the proposed gold extraction, the only one qualified to analyze the alien environment and its unforeseen dangers. To send a mission without its chief architect, he contended, was to invite failure. It was a classic schism of their personalities: the bureaucrat versus the pioneer, the king versus the explorer. Anu, in his weary wisdom, saw the truth in both arguments. He needed Enlil's steady hand to manage the political and logistical fallout on Nibiru, to keep their society from fracturing under the immense strain of this last hope. But he also knew Enki's genius was irreplaceable in the field. He brokered a fragile peace, a division of power that would echo down through the ages. Enki would lead the first expedition, the landing party. He would be the man on the ground, the Lord of Ki, just as his name foretold. He would establish the base, test the environment, and begin the preliminary operations. Enlil, however, would retain ultimate command. He would be the final authority, a voice of judgment transmitted across the gulf of space, reviewing Enki's progress and issuing the final commands. It was a solution born of necessity, but it planted a seed of resentment, creating a dynamic of the field agent and the distant commander. A power struggle that was now destined to play out on a planetary scale. To temper the ambitions of his sons, Anu decreed that a third key figure would join the mission: his daughter, Ninhursag. She was their chief medical officer, a master of biology and genetics, a serene and brilliant mind who held a position of respect that even her warring brothers could not easily challenge. She would be the neutral party, the caretaker of the crew's well-being, and a scientific peer to Enki. With the command structure settled, the preparations began. The celestial chariots, as later primitive eyes would call them, were readied in vast silent hangars carved deep into Nibiru's crust. These were not the crude chemical rockets of humanity's future imagination. They were vessels of exquisite grace, sculpted from materials that shimmered and seemed to drink the faint light, moving without sound or fury by manipulating the very fabric of space-time. A crew of 50 was chosen, a small group of Anunnaki selected for their courage, their scientific acumen, and their psychological resilience. They were pioneers, leaving behind the familiar twilight of their home for the unknown glare of a younger, more vigorous star. Into the heart of the main vessel, Enki himself placed the MEs, the tablets of destiny. These were not stone tablets, but shimmering crystals, data storage devices of unimaginable capacity, containing the sum of Nibiru's knowledge: star charts, engineering schematics, biological encyclopedias, and the precise coded instructions for their mission. They were the soul of Nibiru's science, the portable library of a dying world. The departure was a solemn, silent affair. There were no cheering crowds or grand parades. Their situation was too precarious for celebration. As Enki's ship ascended, lifting away from the familiar sculpted cityscape, he watched his world fall away below. Nibiru from space was a majestic sight, a vast orb of deep crimson and swirling violet, but he could see the telltale thinness of its atmospheric shroud, a fragile veil clinging desperately to a dying world. As they moved out into the system, the planet shrank to a crescent, then to a star, a fading red ember in the infinite black. The weight of his purpose settled upon him then, a cold, heavy certainty. He was the custodian of that ember's final hope. The journey would be long, impossibly so by human standards. To endure it, to cross the chasm between worlds, the 50 pioneers were sealed into chambers of deep stasis. It was not a dreamless, empty sleep, but a slow, drifting state of consciousness where time became elastic and thoughts flowed like deep ocean currents. Enki, suspended in the cool, humming dark, dreamt. He dreamt of the data his probes had sent back, but now it was alive. He saw churning oceans of impossible blue, continents of vibrant green, and clouds of brilliant white, all under the fierce, life-giving light of a sun that shone with a yellow-white intensity he could barely imagine. He dreamt of the very thing his world had lost. A raw, untamed, profligate abundance of life. The ship, a silent silver teardrop, navigated the cosmos with its own quiet intelligence. It dodged the tumbling debris of what the Sumerian texts would later call the hammered bracelet, our asteroid belt, a treacherous field of rock and ice that was the remnant of an ancient planetary collision. It weathered solar storms and navigated the immense gravitational wells of the outer gas giants, a lonely vessel on a mission of cosmic desperation. Then, after a passage of time that had lost all meaning, a soft, insistent chime echoed through the silent corridors of the ship, pulling the crew from their long slumber. The stasis fields disengaged, and one by one, the 50 pioneers awoke, their bodies slowly readjusting to the flow of time. Enki was the first on his feet, drawn by an irresistible pull to the main viewport. And there it was. Not a dream, not a data point, but a real living world hanging in the velvet blackness. Earth. It was more beautiful and more terrifying than he had ever imagined. The sheer vitality of it was an almost physical blow, the untamed energy rolling off it in waves. The colors were so saturated, so intense, a stark and shocking contrast to the muted, solemn tones of Nibiru. He saw the fury of storms churning in the atmosphere, the glint of sunlight on vast, unbroken oceans, and the deep, verdant blanket of life that covered its lands. He was a scientist, a being of logic and data, but in that moment, he felt a surge of pure, unadulterated awe. He had come to this world as a miner, a savior for his own people. But as he stared at the wild, magnificent, and utterly alien world before him, he felt the first stirrings of a different feeling, the profound and dangerous love of a creator for a new creation. That profound and dangerous love, the awe of a creator for a new creation, held Enki transfixed at the viewport for a long, timeless moment. Below him, the planet turned, a living marble of unrestrained energy, and he knew that observation from the sterile safety of orbit was no longer enough. The mission had to begin. Leaving the great mothership as a silent, watchful sentinel in the high heavens, Enki and his crew of 50 boarded their primary lander, a smaller, more agile craft designed for atmospheric flight. The separation was a smooth, silent disengagement, and the vessel began its long, curving fall toward the sunlit side of the planet. It pierced the upper atmosphere like a silver needle, a sheath of incandescent plasma wrapping around its hull as friction battled with advanced shielding technology. Inside, there was no turbulence, only a deep, resonant hum and the gradual brightening of the cabin as they descended through the thick, white layers of cloud. Through the forward screens, the surface resolved itself from a continental map into a specific geography, a target selected with meticulous care from orbit. It was a flat, green-brown landscape where the waters of several great rivers, snaking like silver serpents, slowed and fanned out, braiding together before surrendering themselves to the waters of a vast, azure gulf. This was the land that would one day be known as Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, chosen by them for its access to fresh water and its gateway to the sea. The lander slowed its descent, its silent engines tasting the air, until it hovered just feet above a marshy expanse, its reflection wavering in the brackish water below. With a final, gentle sigh, it settled onto a patch of solid ground, the landing struts sinking slightly into the soft earth. For a moment, the crew sat in perfect silence, the only sound the quiet hum of the internal systems. They had crossed the void. They had arrived. The main ramp hissed as its seals broke, lowering slowly to meet the alien soil, revealing a slice of a world that was overwhelmingly, impossibly alive. Enki stood at the threshold, the designated first. He took a breath of the ship's recycled familiar air, and then stepped out into the atmosphere of Earth. The sensation was a physical shock. The air was not just air. It was a thick, soupy presence, heavy with a humidity that felt like a warm, wet blanket on his skin and in his lungs. Compared to the thin, cold, sterile atmosphere of Nibiru, this was a living fluid, saturated with the smells of damp earth, of salt from the nearby gulf, and the complex, musky perfume of decaying vegetation and blooming life. It was the smell of a world locked in a constant, ferocious cycle of birth and death. The sound was a symphony of glorious chaos, a wall of noise so different from the engineered quiet of their cities. A million insects droned and chirped in a relentless, high-pitched chorus. Strange birds called from the dense reed beds with piercing cries, and the ever-present wind whispered through the tall grasses. Gravity, too, was a subtle but persistent bully, a touch stronger than Nibiru's, and Enki felt the slight, added effort required for every movement, a constant reminder that he was a visitor in a foreign domain. And the light, the sun was a brilliant, almost violent furnace in the sky, its yellow-white glare so much more intense than the gentle crimson glow of his home world. He had to raise a hand to shield his sensitive eyes, the world appearing in stark contrasts of dazzling light and deep, dark shadow. He took a few more steps, his metallic boots squelching softly in the rich mud. This was it, the very soil that held the key to his people's survival. He knelt, his tall frame folding with a practiced grace, and reached down with an ungloved hand. His pale fingers, instruments of immense scientific precision, first touched the murky water, feeling its surprising warmth, then plunged into the cool, dark mud beneath. He brought a handful of the soil up, feeling its texture, smelling its raw, organic scent. In that moment of contact, the mission ceased to be an abstract plan discussed in sterile council rooms millions of miles away. It became real, tangible, a physical communion between an ancient, dying world and a young, vibrant one. Behind him, the rest of the crew began to disembark, their slender, silver-clad forms appearing like apparitions against the primordial landscape. They moved with a disciplined caution, their senses, like Enki's, besieged by the sheer, overwhelming vitality of this new world. But awe was a luxury they could not long afford. The work began almost immediately. With quiet efficiency, cargo bay doors slid open, and automated machinery glided down the ramp. These were not the brute force tools of a primitive species. Sleek, floating drones fanned out, mapping the immediate area with scanners that penetrated deep into the earth, searching for the most stable bedrock. Construction units followed, humming with a low-frequency energy that caused the earth to part before them, leveling the ground and compacting the foundations without excavating a single clump of dirt. They were shaping the land with sound and focused energy, a process that was at once alien and yet strangely harmonious with the environment. On a carefully selected rise, just far enough from the water's edge, the first structure began to take shape. Prefabricated panels of a lustrous white material lifted from their containers and locked into place, assembling themselves under the guidance of the drones into a clean geometric habitat that seemed both shockingly out of place and yet possessed of its own serene beauty. As the final panels sealed the structure and its internal life support systems came online, a soft hum that created a small, perfect bubble of Nibiru's environment on Earth. Inke gathered his weary 50. They stood before their new home, a tiny outpost of order in a vast wilderness. He raised his hand, and in the strange, heavy air of this new world, he gave their settlement its name. He called it Eridu, a name that, in their ancient tongue, meant home in the faraway. It was a declaration, a comfort, and a constant aching reminder of the red star that now seemed a universe away. Eridu was a marvel, a perfect testament to Anunnaki science and order, a gleaming white city of one born from the primordial marsh. Its central tower pulsed with a soft light, a beacon of reason in the vast wilderness, housing laboratories, communication arrays, and living quarters that were a perfect replica of the serene environments of Nibiru. Enki and his 50 pioneers had created a foothold, a command center from which to conduct their great work. But as Enki's geological survey teams fanned out across the Mesopotamian plains, a frustrating reality began to set in. The gold in this region, the land between the rivers, was alluvial gold, fine dust, and tiny flakes washed down from mountains far to the north. It was present, yes, but it was scattered, difficult to extract in the vast quantities their dying world demanded. Processing it would be inefficient, a monumental effort for a meager return. Their mission required a motherlode, a source so rich and concentrated that it could justify this immense undertaking. Frustrated, Enki deployed his most advanced survey drones, small silent spheres that could map the planet's geology from the upper atmosphere down to the deepest core. They scanned the entire globe for weeks, their sensors tasting the planet's magnetic fields, analyzing its subterranean composition with neutrino probes. The data streamed back to Eridu, forming a three-dimensional color-coded map in Enki's central command chamber. And there, on the map, far to the south, across a vast ocean, a continent glowed with a fierce, undeniable intensity. The drones confirmed what the initial long-range probes from Nibiru had only hinted at. Here, in this land of ancient sun-baked rock and sweeping savannas, were the richest and oldest gold veins on the entire planet. Thick seams of the precious metal locked deep within the Earth's crust. Enki designated this new territory the Abzu, a name from their old tongue that meant the deep source, or the place of primeval deposits. This would be the true heart of their mining operation. The beautiful, water-rich land of Eridu would remain the command post, the Eden. But the real hard work, the toil, would take place in the Abzu. The 50 members of the first landing party were scientists, engineers, and pilots, an intellectual elite. They were not suited for the grueling physical labor of a massive mining project. A message was composed, a beam of tightly focused information sent speeding across the solar system from Eridu's tower to the orbiting mothership, and from there relayed on the long, slow journey back to Nibiru. The message was simple. The gold has been found, but the mission requires a new class of personnel. It requires workers. On Nibiru, Enlil received his brother's request. Ever the pragmatist, he understood the logistical necessity. From a different order of the Anunnaki, a younger, non-royal caste, he conscripted 300 more individuals for the mission to Earth. They were known as the Ikiki. In the great celestial hierarchy of Nibiru, if Anu, Enlil, and Enki were the senior commanders, the Ikiki were the astronauts, the technicians, the rank-and-file soldiers. They were not of the ruling bloodline, and their purpose was to serve the larger goals of the state. They embarked on their own long journey, not with the scientific awe of Enki's first crew, but with the grim resolve of workers dispatched to a distant, difficult post. Their arrival on Earth was starkly different, too. They were not welcomed into the serene laboratories of Eridu. Their ships descended directly into the harsh, dry heat of the Abzu, a land that would become their workplace, their barracks, and their prison. The operation they established was a vision of technological might imposed upon a prehistoric landscape. The Igigi used tools of immense power, handheld instruments that emitted focused sonic vibrations, could turn a cliff face of solid granite into powder. Larger machines mounted on skimmers projected beams of intense energy that lanced deep into the earth, following a seam of gold and vaporizing the surrounding rock. But for all its technological sophistication, the work was brutal, repetitive, and soul-destroying. The Anunnaki, even the lower-ranking Igigi, were beings of immense longevity and intellect, born into a sterile, ordered, and technologically seamless world. Here, they were forced into the dark, claustrophobic confines of deep subterranean mines. The heat was relentless, a suffocating pressure that even their advanced coolant-lined suits struggled to mitigate. The air was a thick, choking cloud of pulverized rock dust that coated everything with a fine, gritty film and worked its way into the joints of their equipment. The darkness of the deep shafts was absolute, broken only by the harsh, sterile glare of their work lamps, which cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the mind. And then there was the noise. Not the chaotic, living symphony of the Mesopotamian marshes, but a maddening industrial cacophony. The high-pitched whine of the laser cutters, the deep, bone-jarring hum of the sonic pulverizers, the constant crash of rock being moved by automated haulers. It was a hell of heat, dust, and sound, and at the center of it all were the Ikiki. For days that turned into years, and years that turned into centuries, their life was this grim cycle. Descend into the darkness, blast the rock, haul the ore, ascend to the surface for a brief period of rest in their functional sterile barracks, and then descend again. Enki, as Lord of the Earth, had overseen the establishment of the Abzu operation, his scientific mind laying out the mines with perfect geometric efficiency. But his heart was not in mining. It was in the study of this vibrant new world. Increasingly, he left the day-to-day supervision of the Abzu to his lieutenants, preferring to spend his time in his laboratories at Eridu, analyzing the strange flora and fauna of Earth. For the Igigi, this felt like abandonment. They were trapped in the fiery furnace of the world, while the High Command relaxed in a watery paradise. Time stretched on. A Shah, one full 3,600-year orbit of Nibiru passed. The piles of refined gold at Eridu grew into glittering mountains. Shuttles regularly ascended to the mothership, carrying their precious cargo, the only thing that mattered to the distant commanders on Nibiru. But down in the hot, dark, noisy pits of the Abzu, something else was growing alongside the piles of ore. A deep, simmering, and profoundly dangerous resentment. They were gods, after all, weren't they? And yet, here they were, condemned to the work of slaves. That deep, simmering resentment in the hot, dark pits of the Abzu was a seed planted in fertile ground. It was watered by the passing of time, a passage of time on a scale that is difficult for the human mind to grasp. A Shah passed, then another and another, 10 Shahs, 36,000 Earth years. For the Igigi, whose lifespans were vast but not infinite, this was an eternity spent in the deafening, dust-choked darkness, their minds, capable of contemplating cosmic truths, yoked to the brutal, monotonous task of breaking rocks. The initial grim resolve of their mission had long ago evaporated, replaced by a deep, collective weariness that had curdled into a cold, hard anger. They saw the shuttles ascending with their glittering cargo, a steady stream of salvation for a distant world. But their own salvation never came. They were cogs in a machine, forgotten and expendable. The breaking point, when it came, was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, dawning realization that spread like a contagion through the barracks and tunnels. It began with whispers in the moments between shifts, with shared glances of utter exhaustion that spoke more than words. A leader emerged, an Igigi named Alalu, who had once held a position of some authority before being assigned to the Earth mission. He gave voice to their shared misery, articulating the profound injustice of their situation. "We are of the same blood as the commanders," he would say in the hushed, secret gatherings deep underground. "Our bodies are not so different. Why is it that Enki can study the waters and the strange beasts in his shining city, while we choke on the dust of his mines? Why does Enlil sit in his high house and decree our toil, a toil he himself has never known?" He reminded them that it was Enlil, the great commander, who had assigned them their labor, who enforced the quotas, who was the ultimate architect of their suffering. The whispers grew bolder, the secret meetings larger. A plan began to form, a desperate, unthinkable act of defiance. They would not just stop working. They would burn their tools, burn the mines, and confront their masters directly. The rebellion ignited at dawn during the shift change. As the night crew emerged from the shafts, blinking in the harsh African sun, and the day crew prepared to descend, a signal was given. A single, high-pitched cry that echoed across the vast mining complex. In unison, 300 Igigi dropped their energy tools. There was a moment of profound, shocked silence, the first real quiet the Abzu had known in millennia. Then, the silence was shattered by a roar of collective fury. The tools they had just dropped were picked up again, not for work, but for destruction. Laser cutters that had once sliced through granite were now turned on the automated hauling machines, slicing them into molten slag. Sonic pulverizers were aimed at the support structures of the mine entrances, causing them to collapse in great clouds of dust and debris. They set fire to their own barracks, a symbolic act of severing all ties with their former lives of servitude. It was a catharsis of fire and violence, a furious, desperate scream against the ages of toil. When the fires were burning high against the morning sky, they formed a column, an army of rebellious gods. Their faces were grim, illuminated by the flames of their burning prison, and they began to march. Their destination was the source of the decrees, the home of the commander. They marched for Eridu to confront Enlil himself, who had the misfortune of being on a periodic inspection tour of the Earth operations. News of the approaching mob, a moving cloud of dust on the horizon, reached Eridu long before they arrived. The 50 original scientists and engineers, beings of logic and reason, were thrown into a state of alarm. Rebellion was not a concept they were equipped to handle. Enlil, awakened from his rest in the grandest of Eridu's structures, was incandescent with rage. This was not just a work stoppage. It was mutiny, a direct challenge to his authority, an unforgivable breach of the order that defined their very existence. As the army of the Igigi arrived, their anger a palpable wave of heat, they did not attack the city itself. Instead, they surrounded Enlil's dwelling, their numbers a threatening silent ring of accusers. They began to chant, a low menacing rhythm, demanding that the commander show his face. Enlil, barricaded inside, sent his trusted vizier, Nusku, to the gate. Nusku opened a small portal and called out, his voice amplified, demanding to know who was the instigator of this madness. Alalu, the rebel leader, stepped forward from the crowd. He pointed a dust-covered finger at the commander's house. "Every single one of us has declared war," he shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "We have put a stop to the digging. The excessive labor has killed us. Our work was too heavy, the distress too much." The crowd of Igigi roared its approval. Nusku, shaken, carried the message back to Enlil, who listened in disbelief. The sheer audacity of it was staggering, but he was also trapped. His personal guard was small, and the 300 Igigi were desperate and united. For all his authority, he was a king under siege. Realizing the gravity of the situation, knowing that the mission, and by extension, the fate of Nibiru, was now completely paralyzed, Enlil was forced to act. He sent out 2 urgent, simultaneous communications. One was a message of crisis beamed across the void to his father, Anu, the king on Nibiru, apprising him of the unthinkable mutiny. The second was an immediate summons to his brother, Enki. As the master of the Abzu and the Lord of Earth, this rebellion had begun in his domain. The 2 brothers, the commander and the scientist, were now forced into a confrontation not just with the rebelling workers, but with the catastrophic failure of their entire mission. The Emergency Council convened under a pall of unprecedented crisis. In the great assembly hall of Eridu, the air was thick with tension. Enlil, his face a mask of thunderous fury, stood at one end of a polished obsidian table. Across from him sat Enki, his expression unreadable, a mixture of concern and thoughtful calculation. Beside him was their sister, Ninhursag, the chief medical officer, her presence a calm, analytical counterpoint to Enlil's rage. Other senior Anunnaki, the original 50 pioneers, stood along the walls, their faces grim. Presiding over them all was the shimmering, life-sized image of Anu, their father and king, his form transmitted with perfect fidelity across the immense, silent gulf of space. His holographic eyes, ancient and weary, surveyed the scene from his throne room on Nibiru, his disappointment a palpable force even at such a distance. Outside the thick, white walls of the hall, the low, menacing chant of the 300 rebellious Igigi was a constant, unsettling reminder of the mission's complete and utter paralysis. Enlil spoke first, his voice tight with controlled anger. He recounted the mutiny not as a labor dispute, but as a treacherous act of cosmic treason. He described the destruction of their valuable equipment, the cessation of the gold shipments that were Nibiru's only hope, and the intolerable insult of being besieged in his own command center. His solution was simple, brutal, and characteristic of his personality. "Summon the main ship from the heavens," he declared, his fist striking the table. "Let its weapons be brought to bear. We must make an example of the ringleader, Alalu. Let him be disintegrated before his followers. We will restore order through strength. We will force them back into the mines." He saw the problem in terms of discipline and punishment. The order had been broken, and it must be restored forcefully. It was Enki who answered, his voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to his brother's fire. "And then what, brother?" he asked softly. "You vaporize their leader, you terrorize the rest, and you march them back into the pits of the Abzu at weapon point. What then? Will they work with vigor? Or will they work with seething hatred in their hearts? The machines will suffer accidents. The yields will diminish. We will spend more energy policing them than we will mining the gold." He turned his gaze to the silent, watching hologram of his father. "The Igigi have suffered," he stated simply. "We cannot deny it. The work is hard, far harder than we anticipated. They are not built for this kind of relentless, physical toil in a hostile environment. To use force against them is not only cruel, it is inefficient. It will not solve the fundamental problem." Anu, from his distant throne, slowly nodded his head. The cold logic of Enki's argument was undeniable. A resentful, enslaved workforce was a liability. The mission could not succeed under such conditions. For the first time, Enlil was speechless, his call for force blunted by his brother's irrefutable pragmatism. A heavy, desperate silence descended upon the council. They were trapped. Their civilization, which had mastered interstellar travel and could manipulate the very energies of the universe, was being brought to its knees by a simple labor strike. The options before them seemed bleak. They could abandon the Earth mission entirely, which meant returning to Nibiru empty-handed to await the slow, cold death of their world. Or they could capitulate to the Igigi's demands, an unthinkable act that would shatter the command structure and invite chaos. They were gods trapped in a paradox of their own making, their grand design undone by the grit and dust of a mine. Into that hopeless silence, Enki's voice cut through once more, quiet but charged with a new and strange intensity. "The Igigi are right," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of the council. "This is not their work to do, but the work must be done. He paused, letting the weight of the dilemma settle again before he offered his solution. All this time, he continued, gesturing vaguely towards the world outside the sterile room. While the gold has been our only focus, I have been conducting my own studies. Enlil has often called them my distractions, a subtle barb which his brother did not miss. In my explorations of the Abzu, long before the mines were even dug, I encountered the native life of this planet. Not just the plants and the four-legged beasts, but another creature, a curious one. It walks upright, on two legs, like we do. It lives in groups. It communicates with basic sounds. It even uses primitive tools, chipped stones, and sharpened branches. He could feel the council's confusion, their impatience. What did this have to do with their crisis? The creature is primitive, yes. Enki pressed on, his voice crowing with excitement. Its mind is not like ours, but its physical form, its biological essence. It is remarkably compatible. It shares a blueprint with us. I believe it may have evolved from the same cosmic seed we did, eons ago. He now looked directly at his sister, Ninhursag, the one person in the room who would immediately grasp the staggering implication of what he was about to say. We do not need to force the Igigi to do the work, he said, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. We can create a worker, one designed for the task. The room was utterly still. Even Anu's holographic form seemed to lean forward. Let us fashion a Lulu Amelu, Enki proclaimed, using the ancient Anunnaki term for a primitive worker. Let us take this existing creature, this ape-man of the Abzu, and let us alter it. Let us mix its essence with our own. We can impose our image upon it, upgrade its design, jumpstart its evolution. We can make it intelligent enough to understand our commands, to use our tools, to take over the toil in the mines. We can create a servant race. He turned fully to Ninhursag, the master geneticist. You, my sister, have the wisdom and skill. With my design and your hands, we can bring this new being into existence. We can fashion a worker in our own likeness who will bear the yoke for the Igigi. The proposal hung in the silent air, radical, blasphemous, and utterly brilliant. It was a solution to their labor crisis that would not only save the mission, but would change the destiny of the planet Earth forever. Section 7. The silence in the council hall following Enki's audacious proposal was so profound it felt like a physical pressure. It was Enlil who broke it, his voice low and seething with a mixture of horror and disgust. An abomination, he whispered, the word sharp as shattered glass. You speak of creating a monstrosity, a hybrid beast of the field and of the heavens. It is a perversion of nature, a violation of the great cosmic order. He rose to his feet, his towering frame radiating indignation. We came here to mine a metal, brother, not to play God. The unforeseen consequences of such an act of hubris are incalculable. What happens when this creature, imprinted with our own intelligence, turns that intelligence against us? You are proposing to solve a mutiny by planting the seeds of a potential planetary war. His argument was one of passion, but also of caution, a warning against meddling with forces they did not fully comprehend, no matter how advanced their science. He saw only danger, a future polluted by a creature that was neither one thing nor the other. Enki remained seated, calm in the face of his brother's tirade. He did not appeal to emotion, but to the cold, hard reality of their situation. What is your alternative, Enlil? To let our world perish while we stand on ceremony? His gaze then shifted to the shimmering image of his father. The creature I propose would not be our equal. It would be a servant, its genetics carefully limited. We can build in safeguards, controls. It was this pragmatic appeal that finally swayed the king. Anu, his face etched with the worry of a leader bearing an impossible burden, saw the terrible genius in the plan. The survival of Nibiru superseded all other concerns. He gave his consent, but it was conditional and heavy with warning. Proceed. Anu's voice echoed from across the void. But you will heed Enlil's caution. The creature you create must be a worker, not a rival. Ensure that it cannot procreate. We will not have our creation multiplying beyond our control, becoming a plague upon this world. Make them, but make them sterile. With the king's reluctant blessing, the great and terrible work began. Enki and Ninhursag established a new, specialized facility, a gleaming white laboratory built in the serene landscape near Eridu, far from the grit of the mines and the tension of the siege. They called it the Shimti, a name that in their tongue meant the house where the wind of life is breathed in. It was a place of absolute sterility and advanced biological science, a temple to genetics. The first step was to acquire the raw materials. A team was dispatched to the Abzu, not with mining tools, but with nets and tranquilizer darts. They returned with several female specimens of the upright walking hominid Enki had studied, creatures we might now recognize as an advanced form of Homo erectus. In the Shimti, they were kept sedated and treated with a strange, clinical reverence. From them, Ninhursag, with the delicate precision of a master surgeon, extracted the ova, the egg cells. This was the clay of the earth, the biological foundation upon which they would build. At the same time, Enki prepared the divine essence. The ancient myths would later speak of this as the blood of a slain rebellious god, a poetic and perhaps politically convenient metaphor. The reality in the lab was less dramatic, but no less profound. A young, healthy Anunnaki male from the Ikigi ranks volunteered, and from him, the vital genetic material was drawn. It was sequenced, analyzed, and specific genes, those that governed higher reasoning, language capacity, and fine motor skills, were isolated and prepared for the delicate process of insertion. The first attempts were catastrophic failures. In the glowing nutrient baths of the laboratory, Ninhursag combined the hominid egg with the Anunnaki genetic markers and fertilized the hybrid cell. Some failed to divide at all. Others began to grow, but the process was flawed, the genetic codes warring with each other rather than merging. Those embryos that reached a stage where they could be implanted into the wombs of the captured hominid females resulted in tragedy. The Sumerian texts themselves speak of this with a stark honesty, describing a series of monstrous births, creatures with malformed limbs, with organs in the wrong places, beings that were born silent and still, or who survived for only a few moments. It was a procession of horrors born from an imperfect science. Ninhursag, the great life-giver, was distraught, her confidence shattered by the grotesque results of her work. She was ready to declare the project a failure, an impossible dream. Enki, however, refused to concede. He comforted his sister, studying the failures with a scientist's dispassionate eye. The formula is correct, he insisted, pointing to the glowing genetic charts. The error is not in the design, but in the vessel. The hominid womb is too primitive. It cannot provide the complex nourishment and signaling required to bring our creation to term. It was then that Ninhursag, in a moment of desperate inspiration and ultimate scientific sacrifice, saw the only remaining path. The vessel itself had to be of the gods. "The work is my own," she declared with a newfound resolve. "My hands have mixed the clay. Now I shall provide the mold." She would become the surrogate mother. It was a risk of unimaginable proportions, but it was their last chance. Once more, she prepared the delicate fusion of hominid and Anunnaki life. But this time, after the fertilization was complete and the tiny cluster of cells began to divide, she implanted the embryo within her own body. A tense period of waiting followed, every biological marker monitored with breathless anxiety. Then, the time came. In the sterile, silent heart of the Shimti, Ninhursag went into labor. Enki was at her side as she gave birth. The infant that emerged was perfect. It was a marvel, a seamless blend of two worlds. It had the robust build and dark, ruddy skin of the earth creatures, but the shape of its skull, the intelligence in its curious dark eyes, and the structure of its delicate five-fingered hands were unmistakably imprinted with the mark of the Anunnaki. It was the first of a new kind. Enki took the small, crying infant in his hands, a being of two bloodlines, a bridge between heaven and earth. He held it aloft in the sterile laboratory light and gave it its name. "Adamu," he said, the word echoing in the quiet room, "for he is of the earth's clay." The Lulu Amelu, the primitive worker, was born, and in that moment of triumph, the history of the planet was irrevocably changed. The birth of Adamu was a moment of profound, world-altering triumph, but it was also just a single data point, a proof of concept. The cry of one infant in the sterile Shimti was not enough to placate the 300 furious Igigi still surrounding Enlil's residence. Nor was it enough to restart the stalled flow of gold to their dying homeworld. The miracle needed to become a production line. The daunting task now facing Enki and Ninhursag was to replicate their success on a scale large enough to create a viable workforce. Ninhursag, for all her divine strength, could not personally carry every new human to term. The process had to be refined and delegated. Returning to the glowing displays of their genetics lab, they perfected the techniques for in vitro fertilization. But the problem of the gestational vessel remained. So, a call went out among the Anunnaki women stationed on Earth, the scientists, the doctors, the pilots. Ninhursag gathered a team of 14 volunteers who bravely offered themselves as surrogates to bring the new species into being. The ancient texts would remember these as the birth goddesses, who lined up in the house of life to receive the carefully prepared embryos. Using Adamu's perfected genetic template, they first created a batch of 7 males. Then, by deftly manipulating the chromosomal pairings, they designed and gestated a corresponding set of 7 females. The first of these, the female counterpart to Adamu, was a being of equal perfection, and Enki gave her the name Tiamat, a name that echoed the primordial mother of their own cosmology, signifying that she would be the mother of this new lineage on Earth. In this way, a small, stable, and carefully controlled population of the first humans was born, and per the strict decree from King Anu, every single one of them was engineered to be sterile, a beautiful, perfect, but terminal generation. They were a tool, not a new branch on the tree of life. These new beings, with the minds of children in the bodies of adults, could not simply be sent into the savage environment of the prehistoric world, nor could they yet be sent to the harshness of the mines. They were a priceless, delicate creation that needed to be nurtured, studied, and trained for their ultimate purpose. A new environment had to be created for them, a place that was part paradise, part nursery, and part training ground. Enki chose a location in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, not far from his city of Eridu, in a wide, pleasant valley blessed with a gentle river. Here, the Anunnaki brought their technology to bear on the land itself. They dug precise irrigation canals with focused beams of energy, causing the rich, alluvial soil to flourish. They planted orchards of fruit-bearing trees, some native to Earth, and others carefully grown from genetic stock brought from Nibiru. They introduced placid, domesticated animals, creatures bred for their gentle temperament. Around this entire area, they erected a high, shimmering fence, not quite of matter, but of pure energy, to keep the wild, predatory beasts of the earth out, and to keep their precious creations safely inside. They called this place the Eden. In the Sumerian tongue, the name meant the abode of the righteous ones, a place of serenity and order. To its inhabitants, it was the entire universe. It was a world of lush green gardens, of cool, clear water, of gentle animals, and of endless sun-filled days without want or fear. For these first generations of humans, life was an idyllic dream. All their needs were met by the tall, pale gods who walked among them. They were given simple, clean dwellings to live in, and food was always plentiful. They knew nothing of hardship, of hunger, of pain, or of death. The Anunnaki were their keepers, their teachers, and the absolute masters of their reality. Enki, the scientist, took on the role of a proud, doting father. It was he who spent the most time in the Eden, walking among his creations. He saw the spark of his own intellect behind their dark, curious eyes, and it filled him with a satisfaction that went far beyond the success of a mere scientific experiment. He taught them. He gave them their first words, a simplified version of the Anunnaki language. He showed them how to use their clever hands to fashion simple tools, how to tend the gardens, how to care for the animals. These were not yet the hard labors of mining, but the gentle, rhythmic tasks of agriculture and husbandry, the foundational skills they would need to eventually become a self-sustaining workforce. Enlil, however, viewed the entire project with a cold, detached suspicion. He was the stern, unforgiving god in this new pantheon. On his infrequent inspections of the Eden, he did not walk among the humans with affection. He saw them as Enki's folly, a biological time bomb. He saw their growing intelligence not as a marvel, but as a threat. He would watch them from a distance, his mind filled with calculations of risk, seeing only a tool that could one day be turned against its creator. This fundamental difference in attitude between the two brothers created a strange duality for the first humans. Enki was the source of light and knowledge, the benevolent god who gave them gifts. Enlil was the distant, thunderous authority, the god of rules and punishments, whose presence brought a chill to the air of their perfect garden. And so they lived, these first innocent children of two worlds. They grew and they learned in their perfect, isolated paradise, content in their blissful ignorance. They knew nothing of the dying red sun of Nibiru, nothing of the council's desperate gamble, and nothing of the dark, suffocating mines of the Abzu that were their sole reason for being. They were a happy, thriving, and utterly captive population, living out a beautiful, engineered lie, awaiting a destiny they could not possibly imagine. The passing of time in the lush, controlled paradise of the Eden was measured not in the long, slow showers of Nibiru, but in the gentle, repeating cycles of Earth's seasons. The first humans, this beautiful and sterile generation, learned the tasks Enki set for them with a remarkable aptitude. They tended the gardens, cared for the animals, and maintained their simple dwellings with a placid, cheerful obedience. They were the perfect biological machines, the elegant solution to the Anunnaki's labor crisis. Yet as Enki walked among them, a profound and troubling dissatisfaction began to grow within him. He, the master scientist, saw his creation not just as a tool, but as a work of art, and he knew, with an artist's painful clarity, that his masterpiece was incomplete. They had intelligence, but no ambition. They had language, but no art. They had life, but no ability to pass that life on. They were a terminal species, a beautiful evolutionary dead end. His pride as their creator was at war with his duty as an Anunnaki prince. He had fulfilled his mission. He had provided a worker to take the load off the Igigi. The first batches of trained humans had already been sent to the Abzu, and their performance in the mines, under Anunnaki supervision, was exemplary. They worked without complaint, their robust bodies perfectly suited to the toil that had broken the spirit of the gods. The gold was flowing again. The mission was a success, but Enki saw the inefficiency of it all. Creating each new worker in the laboratories of the Shimti was a slow, resource-intensive process. To truly create a sustainable workforce, to populate the mines for the long ages that would be required to save Nibiru, his new species would need to be able to replicate itself. He was caught in a dilemma: to obey the edict of his father Anu and the paranoid oversight of his brother Enlil, or to perfect his creation, and in doing so, truly solve their problem once and for all. He looked at his children, at their innocent, unquestioning eyes, and made a secret, fateful decision. He would defy the decree. He would give them their final forbidden gift. The myths of a later age would tell this story with symbols: a serpent, a tree, a tempting piece of fruit. The reality was an act of deliberate, covert genetic science. Choosing the most advanced of his creations, Adamu and Tiamat, Enki led them to a secluded grove in the heart of the Eden, away from the watchful eyes of the other Anunnaki. Here, in this quiet, sacred space, he completed his work. It was not a conversation, but a procedure. Perhaps it was a simple injection, a carefully formulated hormonal supplement, or a subtle burst of benign radiation from a handheld device. Whatever the method, the goal was to activate the dormant sequences he had deliberately left locked within their DNA, to switch on the latent biological machinery of procreation. He was, in the most literal sense, rewriting their destiny. He was opening their eyes, not to some abstract concept of good and evil, but to the fundamental, biological truth of their own bodies. He was giving them the knowledge of how life creates life. The change was instantaneous and profound. It was not a flash of light, but a quiet, internal dawn of consciousness. Adamu and Tiamat looked at each other, and for the first time, they truly saw each other. They were no longer just companions in a shared, placid existence. They were male and female, two halves of a biological equation. This new awareness rippled outward, transforming their perception of everything. They looked at their own hands, their own bodies, with a sudden, shocking sense of individuality. They were separate, distinct beings, no longer just harmonious parts of the garden's scenery. This sudden blossoming of self-awareness brought with it a cascade of new, bewildering emotions. The ancient stories would call it shame. But it was not guilt. It was the awkward, overwhelming self-consciousness of adolescence. The realization of one's own distinct identity. And with that came the instinct to define and protect that identity. They looked at their own nakedness, which had been as natural as that of the animals around them, and suddenly felt a need for privacy, for a barrier between the self and the world. Using large leaves from the garden, they fashioned simple coverings for themselves. The first tentative act of a species that had just discovered it was separate from nature. It was this simple, profound change that Enlil noticed on his next inspection. He strode into the Eden with his usual air of stern authority, but the atmosphere felt different. The humans, who usually greeted him with a wide-eyed, placid reverence, now seemed hesitant. They averted their gaze. Their eyes held a new and knowing light that he found deeply unsettling. Then he saw it, the crude loincloths of woven leaves. It was an insignificant detail that signified a cataclysmic shift. "What is this?" he thundered, his voice echoing through the perfect garden. "Why do you cover yourselves?" Adamu, his new consciousness still struggling with the concept of deception, answered with a naive honesty. "The Creator, the one who made us. He opened our eyes," the first man explained, "and we saw that we were different." The blood drained from Enlil's face. He knew instantly what had happened. Enki, his treacherous, meddling brother, had defied a direct order from the king himself. Enlil's worst fears had been realized. He saw the future in a terrifying flash. These creatures, now able to breed uncontrollably, spreading across the planet like a weed, 1 billion biological time bombs, each with a spark of Anunnaki intelligence. His fury was absolute. His first act was not to confront his brother, but to punish the vessel of his crime. He raised his hand and pointed to the energy barrier that contained their paradise. "This experiment is over," he roared. "They are flawed, contaminated." Before the shocked and terrified eyes of the first humans, he commanded the gates of the Diine to open, and with his guard, he drove them out. They were cast out from their only home, expelled from their perfect, engineered world, into the vast, untamed wilderness of prehistoric Earth, left to survive on their own, with nothing but the dangerous new knowledge that had cost them everything. The closing of the Eden's shimmering gate was a silent, final act that severed the first humans from their creators and their cradle. Adamu and Tiamat stood alone in a world they did not know. The familiar, perfect garden at their backs, and an endless, terrifying wilderness stretching out before them. The shock was absolute. For the first time in their existence, they felt the pang of true hunger, the bite of a cold night wind against their skin, and the primal, heart-stopping fear of a predator's cry in the deep darkness. The world outside their gilded cage operated on a brutal, simple logic of survival that was entirely alien to them. The gentle, rhythmic tasks Enki had taught them, tending plants, caring for animals, now had to be recalled and repurposed not for pleasant, God-supervised activity, but for a desperate, moment-to-moment struggle to stay alive. They found shelter in a cave, its damp, earthy smell a poor substitute for their clean, dry dwellings. They foraged for edible plants, learning through painful trial and error which fruits were nourishing and which were poison. They learned to fear the shadows, the rustle in the tall grass, the glint of hungry eyes in the night. Enki, from his high tower in Eridu, watched them through his remote instruments, his heart aching with a mixture of profound pity and burgeoning pride. He had been severely reprimanded by Enlil in a furious private confrontation, and was now forbidden from making direct contact with his exiled children. The command from Enlil, now the de facto overseer of the human project, was clear. Let them fend for themselves. If they perish, it is the price of your disobedience. But a creator cannot so easily abandon his creation. In subtle, deniable ways, Enki intervened. A sudden landslide might block the path of a pursuing cave lion. A drone, flying so high as to be mistaken for a bird, might emit a low frequency that guided the lost and thirsty couple toward a hidden spring of fresh water. He could not bring them back to paradise, but he could, and would, nudge the scales of survival ever so slightly in their favor, and survive they did. More than that, they began to thrive, for Enki's forbidden gift was about to bear its first fruit. In the shelter of their cave, Tiamat experienced a new and frightening biological process, one that had not been part of their engineered life in the garden. Without the sterile equipment and medical knowledge of Ninasag, she gave birth to their first child. It was a painful, bloody, and terrifying affair, but the result was a miracle. A small, healthy infant, the first human being born naturally of woman on the planet Earth. They named him Ko-In. Not long after, a second son, Abel, was born. Enki's grand transgression was now a resounding success. His creation was no longer a sterile, limited edition tool. It was a self-replicating, autonomous species, a true new branch on the tree of life. The two boys grew up in this wild world, their lives defined by the struggle for existence. They embodied the two primary paths of early civilization. Kain, following the lessons passed down from the Eden, took to the soil, becoming a farmer, learning to cultivate the native grains of Mesopotamia. Abael, adapting to the wandering herds of the plains, became a shepherd, the first domesticator of flocks. As the human family grew, slowly expanding from a single family into a small tribe, the Anunnaki began to take notice once more. The initial fury over Enki's actions had subsided into a pragmatic acceptance. These creatures, now multiplying on their own, were an even more valuable resource than before. The Anunnaki re-established contact, not as gentle zookeepers in a garden, but as masters demanding tribute. They taught the growing tribe that a portion of their labor was owed to the gods in the sky. The first fruits of the harvest from Kain, the finest unblemished lamb from the flock of Abael. This was the beginning of worship, an economic transaction disguised as piety. It was here that the first great human tragedy unfolded. A dispute arose over the offerings. The Anunnaki leadership, and Enlil in particular, seemed to favor the offerings of the shepherd Abel. His livestock was a mobile, easily managed source of food for the Anunnaki garrisons. The grains of Kain, while valuable, were seasonal and stationary. This preference, this divine favor, sparked a bitter jealousy in the heart of the farmer. It was a resentment fueled by more than just sibling rivalry. It was a competition for the approval and resources of the gods. The tension festered, and in a moment of uncontrollable rage over a rejected offering, Cain confronted his brother in a field and struck him down. The first act of murder, of human killing human, sent a shockwave of horror through the small mortal community and the watching immortal one. This was a consequence of self-awareness that even Enki had not fully anticipated. As punishment, and perhaps to quarantine his violent tendencies, the Anunnaki leaders marked Cain and condemned him to a life of exile, to wander as a nomad in the lands to the east. This judgment, intended as a curse, had an ironic, unforeseen effect. It became a mechanism for dispersal. Cain and his descendants carried their knowledge and their genes into new territories. Meanwhile, Adamu and Tiamat, grieving their lost son, had another child, Sati, whose lineage would continue the story of settlement. Humanity was now on the move. They followed the great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, establishing small, scattered settlements. They were multiplying, their numbers growing from a handful to hundreds, and then to thousands. For the Anunnaki, this explosive, chaotic success was a source of deeply conflicting emotions. For Enki, watching from his tower, it was a source of immense, secret pride. His children were resilient, adaptable, and clever. They were surviving, and they were spreading. But for Enlil, looking down from his command post, the proliferation of mankind was a rising tide of noise and chaos. These unpredictable, emotional, and now violent creatures were spilling out across the landscape, far beyond his ability to easily control them. They were a successful experiment that had become a planet-wide pest, a source of constant, growing annoyance. The seed of humanity, once planted, grew with a wild, uncontrollable vigor that astonished and alarmed its creators. Millennia passed like seasons. The small, scattered tribes of Adamu's descendants grew into nations. They built villages of mud brick and reeds along the great rivers, and these villages grew into bustling, noisy, and chaotic cities. They learned the arts of pottery, of weaving, and most alarmingly, of organized warfare. The Anunnaki had intended to create a simple beast of burden, a biological tool to serve a single purpose. Instead, they had unleashed a force of nature, a species brimming with the same complex passions, ambitions, and flaws as themselves. For Enki, this was a source of endless fascination. He watched their progress like a proud, if concerned father, marveling at their ingenuity and their resilience. But for Enlil, the commander who prized order above all else, the proliferation of mankind was a rising, intolerable cacophony. His disgust became a visceral, palpable thing. When he would descend from the heavens in his gleaming sky chamber, he was no longer greeted by a pristine, quiet wilderness, but by a world teeming with his brother's chaotic creations. He could hear the noise of humanity rising from the earth below, not just the literal sounds of their cities, their markets, and their squabbles, but the psychic noise of their turbulent, unpredictable existence. They fought, they loved, they betrayed, they built, they destroyed, all with a messy, passionate energy that offended his sense of discipline. In his eyes, they had contaminated the purity of the Earth mission. They were no longer a useful tool, but a sprawling planetary infestation, a failed experiment that had spiraled dangerously out of control. He began to privately wish for a way to undo it all, to wipe the slate clean and start again, or better yet, to simply return the planet to its original silent state. He would not have to wait long for the universe to provide him with an opportunity. Deep in the command center of Eridu and aboard the orbiting mothership, the Anunnaki astronomers and orbital mechanics were tracking a celestial event of immense significance. Their home planet, the great wanderer Nibiru, was once again making its majestic 3,600-year journey from the dark, cold depths of space into the inner solar system. For the Anunnaki, its approach was a time of renewed hope, a chance to send the vast stores of gold they had accumulated back to heal their world's atmosphere. But this particular passage, this perihelion, was different. The complex interwoven gravitational calculations of the solar system are a delicate dance, and this time the choreography was deadly. The orbital models, run on their most powerful crystalline computers, showed Nibiru's trajectory, bringing it unusually close to the orbital path of Earth. They would not collide, but the gravitational handshake between the two worlds would be catastrophic. The scientists on the council presented their findings to Enlil, their faces grim. The primary effect would not be earthquakes or volcanoes, but something far worse. The immense gravitational pull of the passing Nibiru would exert a tidal force on the entire planet, and its most vulnerable point was the vast, thick, and slightly unstable sheet of ice that covered the southern continent of Antarctica. The models were irrefutable. As Nibiru passed, it would pull on the ice cap, breaking its precarious grip on the continent's bedrock. A mass of ice and snow, trillions of tons in weight, would slide all at once into the southern oceans. The displacement would be unimaginable. It would not create a wave, but would cause the sea level of the entire planet to rise cataclysmically in a single, surging event. A great wall of water, hundreds of feet high, would race north from the pole, moving at the speed of a skyship. It would scour the continents, wiping the lowlands clean of all life, burying cities and mountains alike. It would be a global deluge, a world-drowning event of cosmic mechanical precision. The Great Flood was not a punishment from the heavens, but a predictable, cyclical, and unavoidable side effect of their own home planet's orbit. For Enki, Ninhursag, and the other scientists, the news was a horrifying portent of destruction. Their immediate priority became planning for the survival of the Anunnaki mission itself. All ground-based operations would have to be evacuated. The mines in the Abzu would be flooded and lost. Their cities, including Eridu itself, would be wiped from the face of the earth. They would have to retreat to the sky to ride out the cataclysm from the safety of their orbiting mothership. But for Enlil, the grim report was not a crisis. It was an answer to his prayers. It was a perfect, elegant, and blameless solution to his human problem. He would not have to order a single death. He would not have to fire a single weapon. The cold, indifferent mechanics of the cosmos would perform the great cleansing for him. The universe itself would erase the stain of humanity from the face of his planet. He convened the High Council of the Anunnaki leadership. He laid out the chilling scientific certainty of the coming deluge. He then made his terrible proposal. They would proceed with the evacuation of all Anunnaki personnel and equipment as planned, but they would do so in secret. The decision to create the Lulu has been proven a mistake, he argued, his voice cold and final. They are unruly, they are violent, and their noise distracts from our purpose. Let the great wave wash over them. Let it be the final word on this failed experiment. He looked at each member of the council, his gaze lingering on his brother, Enki. Using the full weight of his authority as mission commander and invoking the sacred laws of Nibiru that demanded unity in the face of a crisis, he forced them all to swear a binding oath of secrecy. They would save themselves, and only themselves. No warning was to be given to the race of men. They were to be abandoned to their fate, left to drown in the rising tide. Enki, his heart a cold stone in his chest, was forced to take the oath, his words a bitter ash in his mouth. He was now bound by a sacred promise to stand by and watch. As the world of his own children was washed away, the oath, once sworn, became a prison for Enki's conscience. In the years, months, and then mere weeks leading up to Nibiru's fateful passage, the Anunnaki on Earth began their silent, orderly retreat. Under Enlil's strict command, they worked with grim efficiency, dismantling their most vital equipment from Eridu and the mining outposts in the Abzu. Shuttles ascended in a steady, silent stream, carrying personnel, data crystals, and refined gold up to the safety of the great mothership that waited like a patient star in the high heavens. All the while, down on the planet's surface, the race of men continued its vibrant, oblivious existence. They plowed their fields, built their cities, haggled in their markets, and fought their petty wars, completely unaware of the cosmic judgment that was racing towards them. Every day was a fresh torment for Enki. He would walk through their bustling city of Shurupak in the guise of a traveler, his divine nature hidden beneath a simple cloak, and see the world he was sworn to abandon. He saw the intricate patterns a weaver worked into a piece of cloth, the focused frown of a scribe etching a story onto a clay tablet, the laughter of children playing in the dusty streets. He saw life in all its messy, imperfect, and beautiful complexity, and the thought of its imminent total annihilation was a weight that grew heavier with each passing hour. This was not just a failed experiment, as Enlil claimed. This was his family. He spent long, sleepless nights in his observatory tower, wrestling with the chains of his sworn word. To openly defy Enlil and the council was unthinkable. It would mean a civil war among the gods, a schism that would shatter their mission and perhaps doom Nibiru just as surely as the lack of gold. The Anunnaki order was built on a rigid hierarchy and the sanctity of an oath. To break it would be to invite a chaos that could consume them all. And yet, to honor it meant being complicit in the genocide of a species he had come to love. He paced the floors of his chamber, his brilliant scientific mind searching for a flaw in the logic of his trap, a loophole, a variable he had not considered. And then, in the quiet desperation of a pre-dawn watch, he found it. He replayed the moment of the oath in his memory, focusing not on its spirit, but on its precise, legalistic wording. Enlil, in his cold, commanding arrogance, had made them swear, "I shall not reveal the council's decision to any human." The prohibition was on direct communication. It did not forbid him from, say, talking to himself out loud, or from having a one-sided conversation with an inanimate object. It was a lawyer's argument, a semantic deception, but in the rigid, hyperlogical world of the Anunnaki, it was a flaw in the code he could exploit. He would not speak to a man. He would speak to a wall, and a man would just happen to be on the other side. His choice of a human collaborator was simple. It had to be a man of immense faith, intelligence, and resourcefulness, someone who would not question an incredible command from his personal god. He chose Ziusudra, the pious ruler of the city of Shuruppak, a man whose devotion to his patron deity, Enki, was legendary. Ziusudra was a king who governed with a gentle wisdom, a man Enki had observed for many years, whom he knew to be both capable and good. Enki formulated his plan, a secret rendezvous of which only one of the participants would be fully aware. He knew that Ziusudra slept in a modest dwelling near the temple, a house constructed, as many were in the riverlands, from tightly woven reeds plastered with clay. This simple architectural detail was to be the key to saving the world. In the deepest hour of the night, when the moon was new and the city of Shuruppak was wrapped in a profound and trusting slumber, Enki moved like a shadow. He approached Ziusudra's dwelling, a silent divine phantom in the sleeping streets. He did not knock. He did not enter. He stood outside the thin reed wall of the bedchamber where he knew the king was sleeping. Placing his mouth close to the woven reeds, he began to speak, his voice a low, urgent whisper that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the house itself. He did not address the king. He addressed the house. Reed hut, wall, oh wall, he murmured, the words echoing the cadence of the ancient epic poems. Listen, reed hut, and pay heed, O wall. A decision has been made by the gods, a secret I am forbidden to share. A great flood, a deluge of immense water, will sweep over all the lands and destroy all of flesh that breathes. Inside, Ziusudra was jolted from his sleep, his heart pounding. The voice of his god, Enki, was in his room, seemingly speaking from the walls around him, a dream of terrifying clarity. Enki continued, his whisper now shifting to a set of precise technical commands. Tear down your house, Ziusudra. Abandon your worldly possessions and seek only to save your life. Use the timbers to build a vessel of specific design that I will now impart. Let her dimensions be measured and exact. Build a strong roof above it and seal the entire structure, inside and out, with bitumen, the blackest pitch you can find. The instructions he gave were not for a simple boat. He described a cube-shaped vessel, a craft that sounded unstable, but one that was designed to be completely sealed, with no open deck. It was, in essence, a submersible, a ship designed not to sail upon the water, but to be tumbled and tossed within it to survive the all-consuming tidal surge that was to come. And into this vessel, Enki concluded, his voice fading, you must gather your family, your craftsmen, and the seed of all living things, the essence of the beasts of the field, which I will help you to collect. With the message delivered, Enki pulled back into the shadows and vanished, his great act of loving treason complete. Ziusudra lay awake in the sudden silence. The impossible, divine instructions burned into his mind. He knew, with absolute certainty, what he had to do. As the last echoes of Enki's divine whisper faded from the reed walls of his home, Ziusudra was left with a terror and a purpose that eclipsed all other thoughts. He did not hesitate. The word of his god was an absolute command, and the clarity of the warning was unmistakable. At the first light of dawn, he gathered his family and his most loyal craftsmen, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern as he explained the impossible task that lay before them. To the wider population of Shuruppak, who watched with growing curiosity as their king began to dismantle his own house, a different story had to be told. To announce the impending end of the world would only create a panic that would halt their work. Following the cunning advice Enki had woven into his message. Ziusudra presented a tale of personal divine disfavor. The great god Enlil, master of these lands, is wroth with me, he announced to the assembled citizens. His anger is great, and I can no longer dwell here. My master, the wise god Enki, has commanded me to build a vessel and sail south to his own domain in the Abzu, so that I may live under his protection, and Enlil's wrath may be cooled. The explanation, in a world governed by the unpredictable whims of powerful sky gods, was perfectly plausible. The people of the city, saddened by the departure of their beloved king, but understanding of his plight, not only accepted the story, but offered their help, eager to aid his speedy and safe departure. The next 7 days were a blur of desperate, frantic construction. The sounds of sawing wood and the clang of hammered bronze filled the air from dawn till dusk, while the thick, pungent smell of melting bitumen used to waterproof the vessel hung over the city like a shroud. Under Ziusudra's relentless supervision, the strange, cube-like vessel took shape, its dimensions perfectly matching the bizarre but precise instructions of his god. As his craftsmen worked, Enki fulfilled the second part of his promise. Under the cover of night, messengers arrived bearing a strange and precious cargo. This was not the parade of animals that a later, simpler version of the story would tell. It was a far more scientific and efficient ark. The messengers delivered a series of heavy, sealed containers of Anunnaki design. Within them, suspended in cryogenic stasis, were the building blocks of life: fertilized embryos, seed banks, and countless vials containing the carefully catalogued genetic essence, the DNA of the creatures of Earth. Ziusudra was not being asked to be a zookeeper. He was being made the custodian of a planetary genome library, the last hope for restoring the world's biodiversity. On the 7th day, as the last layers of pitch were applied and the great vessel was declared complete, a strange stillness fell upon the land. The winds died down, the air grew heavy and thick, and a low, almost subaudible tremor could be felt deep within the earth. The final Anunnaki shuttles, unnoticed by the preoccupied humans, made their final silent ascents, leaving the cities of Mesopotamia utterly abandoned by their creators. Ziusudra knew his time was up. He ushered his family, his wife, his sons, and their wives, and the families of his loyal craftsmen into the dark, cavernous interior of the ship. The precious genetic cargo was secured. With a heavy heart, he took one last look at the world he knew, at the city of Shuruppak, gleaming under a strangely leaden sky. And then, with the help of his sons, he pulled the heavy hatch shut, sealing it from the inside and plunging them into an absolute suffocating darkness. The end did not begin with a storm. It began with a groan, a deep, resonant shudder that seemed to rise from the very core of the planet. Far to the south, the Antarctic ice shelf, tormented by Nibiru's immense gravitational pull, had broken free. A moment later, the true deluge began. From their vantage point on the orbiting mothership, the Anunnaki watched in horrified awe as a disturbance appeared on the southern pole of their planetary display screens. It was a ripple, a planetary concussion that fanned out from Antarctica. On the ground, the horizon to the south began to darken, not with storm clouds, but with a solid, climbing line that blotted out the sky. It was the sea, rising as one. It moved with an unnatural, silent speed until it was upon the shorelines, and then it hit with a single, deafening roar that was the sound of a world being broken. The great ship of Ziusudra was lifted violently, tossed and spun like a child's toy in a maelstrom. Inside, there was only darkness, the screams of his family, lost in the unimaginable violence of the churning water, the shriek of grinding rock, and the splintering of 1,000 cities. The world was being torn apart around them, and they were trapped in its heart, a tiny sealed pocket of life in an ocean of absolute death. High above, in the sterile silence of their celestial refuge, the Anunnaki gods watched their grand experiment being erased. The images on their screens were apocalyptic. The blue and green jewel that was Earth was vanishing beneath a single, muddy global ocean. The carefully constructed cities, the mines, the Eden itself, all were gone, scoured from existence. The sight was more terrible than any of them, even Enlil, had imagined. These were beings of immense power and longevity, yet they were profoundly shaken. The ancient texts record their reaction with startling humanity. They did not watch with stoic detachment. They were terrified. They cowered like wet dogs in the corridors of their ship, overwhelmed by the scale of the destruction they had unleashed through their inaction. Ninhursag, the great mother goddess, wept uncontrollably, her cries echoing through the ship. "How could I have commanded such evil in the council of gods?" she lamented. "My people have been laid low, and now they fill the sea like so many flies." Even Enlil, the architect of this policy, was stunned into a grim, horrified silence. The roaring, chaotic waters below were a testament to his restored sense of order. But as he watched the last traces of land disappear, he was confronted with the terrible, silent truth of what he had done. He had murdered a world. For 6 days and 7 nights, the world was a symphony of chaos, and the great sealed ark was its unwilling instrument. Ziusudra and his family were tossed in the absolute darkness, their sense of time and direction lost to the violent churning maelstrom. They were a single, fragile seed of life, encased in a wooden shell, adrift on an ocean that had consumed a planet. Then, on the 7th day, a new sensation slowly dawned upon them. The violent tumbling began to subside, replaced by a gentle, rhythmic rocking. The deafening roar of the world being torn apart faded into a vast, oceanic hush. The storm had passed. The waters were calming. Ziusudra, guided by a deep, prayerful intuition, opened a small air hatch he had built into the roof. He peered out. In every direction, as far as the eye could see, there was nothing but a flat, grey, and unbroken expanse of water, meeting a sky of the same mournful, featureless color. The mountains were gone. The cities were gone. The world he knew had been replaced by a single, silent ocean. The ark drifted for days upon this new, placid sea. Inside, the survivors tended to the precious genetic cargo and rationed their supplies, their lives a strange limbo between a dead past and an uncertain future. All they could do was wait for the waters to give up their prize. Ziusudra knew he needed to find land, the first dry ground of a newborn world. Following a timeless mariner's instinct, or perhaps following a final whispered instruction from his divine guide, he decided to use the birds they had brought aboard to survey the endless water. First, he released a dove from the hatch. It flew in great, hopeful circles, but finding no branch, no perch, no sign of anything solid in the vast emptiness, it returned to the ark, exhausted. Ziusudra took it back inside. A day later, he released a swallow. It too soared across the watery expanse, its darting flight a desperate search, but it also found nothing and returned to the safety of the vessel. The hope of the survivors began to wane. Finally, after more days of patient drifting, he released a large black raven. The raven flew off, but unlike the others, it did not return. It had found something to feast upon, the floating carrion and debris from the drowned world, which meant the waters were receding, and the grim evidence of the planet's death was beginning to surface. Soon after, a new sound broke the monotony of their drift. It was a low, scraping, grinding noise that vibrated through the hull of the great ship, a final, jarring lurch, and then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the vessel was still. It had come to rest. The ark had made landfall. With trembling hands, Ziusudra gathered his sons, and together they pushed against the great sealed hatch. It swung open with a groan, flooding the dark interior with a sunlight so brilliant it was almost painful. He was the first to step out, his feet sinking into the soft, wet mud of a mountainside. He breathed his first breath of the new world's air. It was sharp, cold, and achingly clean, as if the planet itself had been washed pure. But the sight that greeted him was one of utter, heartbreaking desolation. They were perched on the slope of a colossal mountain, its peak the only thing visible above the receding waters. And below them, stretching to every horizon, was not a world of green life, but an endless brown ruin, a planetary sea of mud, littered with the splintered remains of forests, the corpses of strange beasts, and the ghosts of a civilization now returned to clay. Everything was gone. Overwhelmed by a tidal wave of grief for his lost world and profound shuddering gratitude for his survival, Ziusudra fell to his knees. He then did the only thing he knew how to do. He gave thanks. He gathered stones to build a makeshift altar, arranged kindling, and prepared a sacrifice of thanks to the god who had saved him. Its sweet, roasting scent, the first human smell to rise into the clean, empty air of the post-Diluvian world. High above, the aroma, that familiar, tantalizing scent of roasting meat and sweet incense, wafted through the sterile, recycled air of the Anunnaki mothership. For the weary and hungry gods who had subsisted on tasteless rations while watching the world drown, the smell was an irresistible summons. One by one, their smaller shuttlecraft detached from the mothership and descended through the clouds, drawn to the lonely plume of smoke on the mountain top. The ancient texts describe the scene with a strange poetic honesty. The gods gathered like flies around the sacrifice, their divine hunger and relief overriding all other concerns. Enki and Ninhursag were the first to greet Ziusudra, their faces filled with a profound and weary relief. But then another ship arrived, larger and more menacing. Enlil strode out, and his eyes fell upon the ark, the smoke, and the small cluster of living, breathing humans. His face, which had been a mask of grim shock, contorted into a new expression of pure fury. He had been betrayed. How? He roared, his voice booming across the silent mountaintop. How did any flesh escape the destruction? Who broke our oath? His burning gaze fell immediately upon his brother, Enki, who met it without flinching. But before the confrontation could erupt into a fresh celestial war, Ninhursag, the mother goddess, stepped between them, her face stained with tears of both sorrow and joy. She raised her hands, not in anger, but in a gesture of blessing towards Ziusudra and his family. "Enough," she cried. "Enough destruction. Life has survived. My children have survived." The other Anunnaki, deeply chastened by the horror they had witnessed from orbit, murmured their assent. The sheer, awful finality of the flood had purged them of their anger, replacing it with a deep, collective remorse. Enlil, for the first time, found himself utterly alone, his rage isolated and impotent against the tide of their shared guilt. He looked at the small family of shivering survivors, at the vast dead world they had inherited, and the cold fury in his heart finally broke. A great weariness settled over him. He approached Ziusudra, and in an act that stunned everyone, he took the mortal man and his wife by the hands. He blessed them, granting them a special status, a promise of longevity. It was a treaty, a peace offering. A new vow was made on that muddy summit, not sworn in a council room, but born from shared trauma. They would never again seek to destroy the human race. Their task now was not to cleanse, but to nurture. On the peak of Mount Ararat, amid the ruins of a drowned world, the gods and the last man forged a fragile, uncertain promise to begin anew. The fragile pact, made on the muddy peak of Mount Ararat, born from the shared trauma of a world destroyed, fundamentally and irrevocably altered the Anunnaki mission on Earth. The old world was gone, buried beneath a thick, suffocating blanket of silt and brine. Their beautiful, pioneering city of Eridu, the home in the faraway, was now a deep, silent memory beneath the mud. The vast mining operations in the Abzu, the entire reason for their perilous journey, were flooded, collapsed, and utterly lost. The strategy of direct, industrial-scale resource extraction was over. A new plan was needed, a new relationship with the planet and with the handful of mortals they had, by a traitorous act of mercy, allowed to survive. In the solemn council that followed, held not in a grand hall, but aboard their orbiting mothership, the mood was starkly different from the angry, panicked debates that had preceded the flood. Enlil, no longer a furious commander demanding order, was now a pragmatic and deeply chastened leader. The sheer, awesome power of the deluge had humbled him, forcing him to confront the limits of his control. He acknowledged the failure of their old way and the undeniable resilience of his brother's creation. They would no longer treat the earth as a simple mining colony and humanity as a disposable tool. They would now embark upon a new, far more ambitious project. They would become the architects of civilization. They would raise humanity up, guide them, teach them, and in return, a grateful and prosperous mankind would serve them, providing the resources and loyalty they required in a more sophisticated and sustainable partnership. They would shift from being miners to being kings. Their first task was to establish a new operational center on the cleansed face of the planet. They needed a new spaceport, a new mission control, a new link to Nibiru. Surveying the globe from orbit, they chose a location that was geographically stable, centrally located between the great river valleys, and had survived the flood's fury largely intact, a high arid plateau of ancient limestone. This was the Sinai Peninsula. Here, they built their new post-Diluvian spaceport, a facility hidden from primitive eyes, to aid in navigation for the great ships arriving from the deep. They designated a landing corridor using the twin peaks of Mount Ararat as a distant anchor point in the north. Closer to the spaceport, on the western side of the Great Nile River, they commissioned the construction of artificial mountains, massive, perfectly aligned pyramids, whose shimmering capstones would serve as unmistakable landing beacons, visible even from high orbit. This region would become the new navel of the earth, the sacred, restricted center of the god's power. From this new hub, the Anunnaki leadership made the momentous decision to partition the habitable world into three distinct regions of development. They would not concentrate humanity in one place again. To do so would be to invite the same chaotic, noisy overcrowding that had so disgusted Enlil. They would divide the descendants of Ziusudra, sending each of his three sons and their growing families to a different great river valley to become the seed of a unique and separate civilization. The first region, the traditional heartland, was Mesopotamia, the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This territory was to remain the domain of Enlil and his clan. It would be designated the Land of the Name, the center of official Anunnaki authority on Earth. Here, civilization would be re-established according to Enlil's strict sense of order. Kingship, the concept of a human ruler acting as a steward for the gods, would be lowered once more from heaven, and great cities like Kish, Uruk, and Ur would eventually rise from the mud. The second region, the long, fertile ribbon of the Nile Valley, was allocated to Enki and his lineage. This vast and ancient land, with its predictable, life-giving annual flood, was a perfect laboratory for Enki's scientific and creative mind. His eldest son, Marduk, who would later be revered there under the name Ra, was given primary dominion over this land, which would become the civilization of Egypt. Here, humanity would be taught a different set of skills. The deep mysteries of the stars, the precise arts of astronomy and stonemasonry, and a profound, complex theology focused on the cycles of death, preservation, and rebirth. The third region was the most distant of the three, the vast plains fed by the mighty Indus River. This great land, rich in mineral and agricultural wealth, was granted to their sister, Ninhursag. As the great life-giver, the nurturer and geneticist, it was fitting that she would oversee a civilization that would become known for its remarkable feats of urban planning, its sophisticated trade networks, and its unique, still indecipherable spiritual traditions. This would become the Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley, a third, independent branch of the human experiment. And so the seeds of the new world were sown. The Anunnaki descended once more, bringing with them the contents of Ziusudra's genetic ark. They provided the survivors with new, hardier strains of wheat and barley, engineered to thrive in the changed post-flood climate. They gifted them the knowledge of irrigation, the secrets of the calendar, the blueprint for law, and the structure of a divinely ordered society. But in this neat, tripartite division of the earth, they also laid the foundations for millennia of rivalry and conflict by granting each major god and his lineage their own domain, their own kingdom of mortals to command. They had simply transposed their own celestial jealousies and power struggles from Nibiru onto the fresh mud of the earth. The stage was now set for the next great act of history, one in which human civilizations would rise and fall, not always by their own hand, but according to the great and terrible game being played by their immortal masters. The new world bloomed under the careful, coordinated guidance of its immortal masters. In the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, the sun-drenched valley of the Nile, and the sprawling plains of the Indus, the descendants of Ziusudra multiplied with astonishing speed. The seeds from the Ark's genetic library yielded bountiful harvests, and the small tentative settlements grew into fortified towns, then into thriving populous cities. With this success, however, came a new and complex problem for the Anunnaki: the problem of scale. In the early days after the flood, when humanity numbered only in the hundreds, it was a simple matter for a god to walk among them, to issue commands directly, to settle disputes with a word. But now, with tens of thousands of mortals living in a dozen different cities, this kind of direct personal governance was no longer possible. The Anunnaki were a small group of overseers, not a vast bureaucracy. Enlil, in particular, had absolutely no desire to spend his long, immortal life mediating petty human squabbles over land rights and water access. They needed a more efficient system, a command structure that would allow them to govern by proxy, to transmit their will without having to be physically present in every corner of their growing domains. The solution, devised in the Anunnaki Council, was a stroke of political genius that would shape the destiny of the human race for millennia to come. They would invent the concept of monarchy. They would choose one mortal man from each community, a man of exceptional ability, charisma, and loyalty, and they would elevate him above all his fellows. He would be the king. This king, however, would not rule by his own authority, nor by the consent of the people. His authority would flow directly from the heavens. He would be the chosen representative of the city's patron god, a living bridge between the mortal and divine realms. His role would be twofold, encompassing both the earthly and the celestial. On the one hand, he would be the Lugal, the great man, or shepherd of the people. It was his sacred duty to administer the god's laws, to ensure justice was done, to organize the great labor projects of building canals and temples, and to lead the city's army in defense. On the other hand, he was the Ensi, the high priest. He, and he alone, would be permitted to enter the innermost sanctum of the god's temple, to receive the divine commands, and to transmit the prayers and tribute of the people back to their celestial master. This fusion of political and religious authority into a single office, that of the priest-king, created a powerful and self-reinforcing system of control. To disobey the king was to disobey the god himself. This new political technology was first perfected in Mesopotamia, the domain of Enlil, the land where order and hierarchy were paramount. The ancient Sumerian king lists, those stark, bureaucratic records of 1,000 years of history, state with a simple, declarative certainty that after the flood had swept over and the kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. This was not a metaphor. For the people of Sumer, it was a literal, historical event. The Anunnaki descended upon the newly founded city of Kish, and from among its people, they selected the man who would be the first post-Diluvian king. They summoned him to the top of the city's great ziggurat, the towering man-made mountain of brick with its stairway to the heavens, which served as the literal meeting place between the Anunnaki and their chosen intermediaries. The investiture ceremony was an awesome spectacle of divine power. The chosen man was brought before the city's patron deity. Perhaps it was Ninota, Enlil's formidable son and chief enforcer. He was ritually bathed and anointed with sacred oils. He was then clothed in a lustrous, brilliantly colored garment, a robe befitting his new station. The god then presented him with the symbols of his divinely sanctioned office: a scepter crafted from a strange, heavy celestial metal that never tarnished, a lapis lazuli tiara that symbolized his connection to the heavens, and a ring of office that served as a seal of his authority. Finally, he was given his city's tablet of destinies, not a prophetic tool, but a literal list of divine instructions, a set of laws, building plans, and production quotas that he was expected to enforce. The god would then place a hand upon the new king's head, and to the awestruck crowd gathered at the base of the ziggurat, a voice, amplified by unseen technology, would boom across the city square, declaring that this man was now their shepherd, the chosen of the gods. Kingship had quite literally descended from heaven. The covenant established on that day was simple and absolute. As long as the king and his people remained obedient, as long as they faithfully worked the fields and workshops designated as the god's property, and as long as they delivered their tribute of grain, beer, livestock, and labor to the temple storehouses, the god would in turn provide them with security from their enemies, wisdom to govern their lives, and the predictable blessings of bountiful harvests and overflowing canals. But if the people or their king were to falter in their duties, that divine favor would be withdrawn. The canals would run dry, the crops would fail, and the city would be left vulnerable to conquest by its rivals. This system proved incredibly effective, creating a stable and productive social order that allowed civilization to flourish at an unprecedented rate. It ensured the Anunnaki's will was done, and their needs were met without requiring their constant meddling presence. But it also set a dangerous precedent. By linking divine favor to earthly power, it sanctified not only governance, but also conflict. Soon, the kings of various city-states, each claiming the absolute backing of their own patron god, would be encouraged to test their strength against one another, turning the fertile plains of Mesopotamia into a chessboard for the continuing rivalries of their immortal masters. The system of divine kingship worked with remarkable efficiency, and for a time, a golden age of peace and progress dawned upon the post-Diluvian world, with humanity neatly organized into productive, obedient city-states. The Anunnaki could focus on their primary mission, overseeing the slow but steady accumulation of Earth's resources needed to save Nibiru. The elder gods, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag, governed their respective domains with a weary wisdom born from having witnessed the world's destruction and rebirth. But this fragile peace, this new, carefully constructed order, was not destined to last. It was not the creation, but the creators themselves who would shatter it. The old rivalry between the pragmatic Enlil and the ingenious Enki had not vanished. It had merely gone dormant, and its bitter seeds had been passed down to their children. A new generation of gods who had not been humbled by the great flood, and who possessed all of the ambition of their fathers with none of their restraint. This younger generation, many of them born on earth, and seeing it as their rightful inheritance, began to jockey for power and prestige. In Mesopotamia, Enlil's clan held sway. His son and heir was the fierce warrior god Ninurta, a master of celestial weaponry and a staunch defender of his father's order. But the most ambitious of the Enlilite clan was his granddaughter, Inanna, a goddess of dazzling, contradictory passions. Known to a later age as Ishtar, she was the goddess of both love and war, and her insatiable hunger for power, territory, and worship drove her to constantly scheme and expand her influence, not content with merely being the patron of her great city of Uruk. In the lands of the Nile, Enki's lineage ruled. His firstborn son, Marduk, later revered in Egypt as Ra, was brilliant and proud, having inherited his father's scientific genius, but not his subtle, patient temperament. Marduk nursed a deep and abiding resentment. He believed that Enlil had unjustly usurped the supreme command of the Earth mission from his father, Enki, and that he, as Enki's true heir, was the one who deserved to rule over all the gods and all the mortals on the planet. This clash of divine ambitions soon spilled over from the celestial council chambers onto the dusty plains of Earth, and the new system of human kingship became the perfect instrument for their proxy wars. The incessant, brutal, and well-documented conflicts between the ancient Sumerian city-states, which historians attribute to disputes over water and territory, were, in reality, the physical manifestation of the gods' own rivalries. The king of Lagash, who served the god Ninota, would suddenly find a divine imperative to march against the neighboring city of Umma, whose king served a rival deity. On the battlefield, the Anunnaki's lessons in organized warfare were brought to bloody fruition. Thousands of human soldiers, their lives sworn to their king and by extension to their god, would clash in disciplined formations, a terrifying spectacle of bronze helmets, heavy shields, and piercing spears. For the most part, the gods would remain behind the scenes, content to let their human pawns bleed for their ambitions. But sometimes, when a battle was going poorly, or a strategic objective was too important to be left to chance, a patron god would make a direct and terrifying intervention. A Sumerian soldier, in the heat of a desperate battle, would look up and see his god's shining celestial boat descend from the heavens, hovering over the battlefield. From this craft, a weapon beyond human comprehension would be unleashed. It might be a beam of light so intense it could vaporize a section of the enemy's ranks, a wave of concussive force that threw men and chariots aside like toys, or a sound so terrible it could shatter the very stones of the enemy's city walls. To the mortal soldiers it was a miracle, a terrifying and glorious sign of their god's favor. In truth, it was an advanced weapon of war, deployed with cold, strategic calculation. The age of progress was slowly giving way to an age of divinely sanctioned holy war. The conflict eventually escalated beyond these regional squabbles in Mesopotamia. The ultimate prize, the true seat of power on Earth, was the post-Diluvian command center. The Sinai spaceport and its associated landing corridor, marked by the Great Pyramids of Giza. Whoever controlled this facility controlled all contact with the home planet, Nibiru. It was the key to ultimate authority. Marduk, growing ever more powerful and impatient in his Egyptian domain, decided the time had come to claim what he believed was his birthright. He made a bold play to seize control of the entire Anunnaki command structure, challenging the Enlilite authority directly. This ignited the first great war of the gods, a conflict later remembered in distorted Egyptian myths as the celestial battles between Horus and Seth. This was no proxy war fought with human soldiers. This was a high-tech conflict fought between the gods themselves. Ninota, champion of the Enlilites, led the defense of the spaceport. His aerial craft, described in the texts as a divine stormbird, engaged in furious dogfights with Marduk's forces in the skies above the Sinai. On the ground, terrible energy weapons were deployed, their power scarring the very landscape and turning ancient rock to molten glass. The Giza pyramids, those serene and silent beacons, became the centerpiece of a devastating celestial war. Ultimately, Marduk's rebellion was suppressed. He was defeated, stripped of his authority, and forced into a humiliating exile. But the war had been a catastrophe for all involved. The delicate peace of the new world was shattered, and the unity of the Anunnaki was broken. Marduk, in his exile, was not repentant. His heart burned with a cold, patient hatred, and he vowed that one day he would return and claim his throne, no matter the cost. The fragile truce that concluded the Pyramid Wars was less a peace treaty and more a cold, resentful stalemate. Marduk, defeated and exiled, was a simmering volcano of ambition, his humiliation fueling a patient, calculated desire for ultimate power, while his official punishment barred him from the centers of Anunnaki authority in Egypt and the Sinai. It did not extinguish his influence. After a period spent wandering in distant lands, he made a clandestine return to Mesopotamia, the very heartland of his Enlilite rivals. He could not challenge them again with open warfare. His forces were scattered and his reputation tarnished. So he chose a new, more insidious strategy. He would not conquer humanity. He would win them to his cause. He established a new base of operations in a city that, until then, had been of minor importance, a settlement on the banks of the Euphrates River called Babylim. Here, he presented himself not as a distant, demanding god, but as a champion of mankind, a divine teacher willing to share the secrets that the paranoid Enlil and his clan had kept for themselves. He promised the king and the people of Babylim knowledge, prosperity, and a direct path to the heavens. Under Marduk's charismatic and secret tutelage, the people of Babylon embarked upon the most ambitious construction project the post-Diluvian world had ever seen. They would build a ziggurat, a great temple tower. But this would be no ordinary stairway to the gods. It was to be a structure of unprecedented scale, designed to reach unto heaven. Marduk, applying his own profound knowledge of Anunnaki engineering, guided their work. He showed them new techniques for baking bricks, making them as strong as stone, and for bonding them with bitumen, making the structure resilient and waterproof. The tower, which would be called Etemenanki, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, rose in 7 magnificent stages, a man-made mountain dominating the flat river valley. But its purpose was far more than religious devotion. Marduk was playing a long and subtle game. The city's very name, Babylim, meant gateway of the gods. This was his literal intent. The uppermost stage of the tower was designed to be capped with a special shimmering material, and its internal structure was aligned with the stars. The human builders, in their pride, declared to one another, "Let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name." In the Anunnaki tongue, the word for name and for their sky vehicles, their rockets, was the same, Shem. Marduk was secretly guiding humanity to build its own launch tower, its own Shem, a direct technological challenge to the Enlilite monopoly on space travel. News of this monumental undertaking eventually reached Enlil in his Mesopotamian capital. At first, he dismissed it as yet another act of human vanity, another king trying to outdo his rivals. But the reports from his intelligence network became more and more alarming. The scale of the tower, its unusual design, and its location in a city known to be a hotbed of pro-Marduk sentiment raised a constellation of red flags. He decided he must see this for himself. When Enlil's celestial chariot descended from the clouds, and he laid his own eyes upon the Tower of Babel, his deepest fears were confirmed. He saw not just a temple, but a clear imitation of Anunnaki launch facilities. He recognized the advanced structural principles, the precise astronomical alignments. He saw his brother's brilliant, treacherous hand in every detail. Most of all, he saw a unified humanity, all speaking one language, working as one people, using the very knowledge the gods had given them to grasp for equality. The biblical account captures his horrified realization with perfect clarity. "Behold," he said to his council, "the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do." He saw a future where humans, guided by his rogue nephew, would build their own skyships, travel to other worlds, and perhaps even challenge the gods for control of the solar system. This ultimate act of hubris had to be met with an ultimate, definitive punishment. Enlil decided it was not enough to simply destroy the tower. He had to destroy the very foundation of human cooperation that had made it possible. He summoned his loyalists, and in the dead of night, they descended upon Babylon. They did not use conventional weapons that would leave rubble and craters. They used a force that was at once more subtle and more terrifying. A low vibrational hum filled the air, and the great tower, the product of generations of labor, was shaken to its foundations, its structure collapsing in on itself in a great cloud of dust and ruin. The physical threat was neutralized, but Enlil's true masterstroke was yet to come. The root of the problem, he had decided, was unity, so unity itself had to be shattered. Fanning out across the land of Sumer, the Anunnaki deployed a technology that worked not on brick and mortar, but on the human mind. The ancient texts call it the confounding of the language. It may have been a focused sonic wave or a neurological frequency that subtly rewired the linguistic centers of the brain. The effect was immediate and devastating. A mason would turn to his fellow worker to ask for a tool, and the words that came out were alien gibberish. A mother would call to her child, and the child would stare back in blank, fearful incomprehension. Language, the glue that held their civilization together, had dissolved overnight into 1,000 mutually unintelligible dialects. Communication collapsed into suspicion, fear, and chaos. The great unified human project was over. Unable to understand one another, the terrified and mistrustful populations abandoned their cities and began to migrate, scattering in small, linguistically isolated clans across the face of the earth. Enlil had restored his order, but he had done so by condemning humanity to an age of division and misunderstanding. The scattering of humanity after the fall of Babel's great tower achieved Enlil's primary objective. The threat of a unified, technologically ambitious human race was neutralized, but it also created a new and dangerous political landscape. With humanity fractured into a multitude of suspicious, warring tribes speaking a confusion of tongues, the world became a chaotic chessboard for the ongoing Cold War between the Anunnaki factions. Marduk, whose subversive dream of a human-built gateway to the stars had been so spectacularly ruined, was not defeated, merely displaced. He continued to move through the world as a rogue agent, a charismatic god of rebellion, gathering allies among the disenfranchised and promising knowledge to those who would pledge their loyalty to him and not to the rigid, domineering Enlilites. In response, Enlil and his council knew they needed more than just a system of kingship to maintain control. They needed a loyal human army, a mobile force that could secure their most vital interests, particularly the sacred landing corridor in the lands of Canaan that led to the Sinai spaceport. They found their perfect human instrument in a man of noble Sumerian lineage from the great city of Ur, a brilliant and devout military commander named Ibruam. This man, who would be known to history as Abraham, was a descendant of the high priests and possessed an unshakable faith in the authority of Enlil. He was summoned, tested, and chosen by the Anunnaki leadership for a crucial mission. He was to take his family, his retinue, and his elite corps of soldiers and migrate to the lands of Canaan. There, he would act as the Enlilites' trusted human general, a mobile force to patrol the borders of their sacred territory, to keep the trade routes open, and to quell any rebellions stirred up among the local tribes by Marduk's agents. Abraham accepted the divine command without question, beginning the great journey that would set the stage for the next terrible chapter in the War of the Gods. While Abraham was establishing his presence in Canaan, Marduk was busy building a new and formidable power base. He had found fertile ground for his revolutionary message among the rich and decadent city-states of the Jordan Valley, nestled in the deep geological rift that held the Dead Sea. 5 of these cities, including the powerful twin capitals of Sodom and Gomorrah, grew wealthy from the mining of the region's abundant bitumen and from their control of key trade routes. Influenced by Marduk's promises of even greater wealth and power, they renounced their fealty to Enlil and secretly pledged themselves to the rogue god. But this was more than a simple political rebellion. Enlil's spies soon brought him news that was far more alarming. Under Marduk's guidance, the people of Sodom were using their technical skills to construct a new, clandestine space facility at the southern end of the Dead Sea, a hidden port from which Marduk could launch his own craft and once again challenge the Enlilite monopoly on celestial travel. The news that a second bubble was being attempted, this time in secret and on the very doorstep of their primary spaceport, sent the Anunnaki Council into a state of high alert. A direct military assault, like the Pyramid Wars, was deemed too risky and too costly. It could escalate into a full-blown civil war that would devastate the planet. They needed a different solution, a surgical strike of such overwhelming and terrifying power that it would not only eliminate the immediate threat, but would also serve as a permanent, unforgettable warning to any other humans who might consider siding with Marduk. After a grim and momentous debate, the decision was made. They would authorize the use of their most feared and seldom used armaments, the 7 weapons of terror. The ancient texts describe them with names like the one whose impact spreads and the one that turns the sky to darkness. These were tactical nuclear devices. Enlil's son, the warrior Ninurta, and Nergal, a son of Enki, who had sided fiercely with the Enlilites against his own rebellious brother, were chosen to command the terrible mission. Even in this moment of cold strategic calculation, a flicker of something resembling mercy was shown. Abraham's nephew, Lot, had settled in the city of Sodom, and the Anunnaki had no wish to harm the kin of their most loyal human servant. So 2 of their intelligence agents were dispatched to the city, arriving in the guise of simple travelers. These were the angels of the biblical account. They located Lot, warned him of the impending total destruction of the city, and commanded him to gather his family and flee into the mountains without delay. They gave him one final chilling instruction. When the destruction begins, do not stop, do not hesitate, and under no circumstances are you to look back. At dawn, the next day, as Lot and his family were scrambling up the rocky hillsides, a lone Anunnaki flyer appeared high in the sky over the placid, shimmering waters of the Dead Sea. From its belly, a single object was released. There was no sound, only a flash of light so brilliant it was like a new sun being born in the heart of the valley. A light that bleached all color from the world. A moment later, a wave of unbearable heat rolled across the landscape, and a deafening roar finally shattered the morning silence. A great, terrifying cloud, a pillar of smoke and fire, rose into the sky, churning and boiling, its shape like a monstrous, blooming flower. The 5 cities of the plain, Sodom, Gomorrah, and their neighbors, were instantly and utterly vaporized. The waters of the sea itself boiled, and the very ground was superheated into a glassy, crystalline crust. Lot's wife, overcome by a fatal curiosity or grief for her lost home, ignored the command. She turned to look back into the heart of the incandescent blast, and in that instant, she was turned into a pillar of salt. A poetic and chillingly accurate description of a body being instantly desiccated and flash fossilized by an intense thermonuclear explosion. From his vantage point, many miles away in the hills near Hebron, Abraham saw the column of smoke rising from the valley, as the smoke of a great furnace. Marduk's power base was annihilated. His secret spaceport was a radioactive crater, but a terrible new precedent had been set, and a deadly, evil wind was now beginning to blow from the smoldering ruins. The mushroom cloud that rose over the Dead Sea Valley was a terrible, smoldering tombstone for Marduk's ambitions. In the High Council of the Anunnaki, the mission commanders, Ninurta and Nergal, reported their success with grim finality. The 5 rebellious cities were gone. The clandestine spaceport was a crater of molten glass. The immediate threat to the Sinai corridor was neutralized. It was a victory, swift and absolute, achieved with a terrifying surgical precision that had avoided the costly and protracted battles of the Pyramid Wars. Yet the atmosphere in the council was not one of celebration. A profound unease lingered. They had unleashed their ultimate weapons, the final sanction, a power drawn from the very heart of the atom, which they had sworn to use only in the most dire of circumstances. Enki, his face a mask of grief, was appalled. He mourned not only for the vaporized cities and the thousands of human lives extinguished in an instant, but for the fundamental law of nature that his kin had so casually and arrogantly broken. He knew that such immense power, once unleashed upon the fabric of a world, rarely remains contained. It leaves a stain, a lingering poison, and he feared the consequences would be far greater than his victorious nephews could possibly imagine. His fears were soon to be realized. Hundreds of miles to the east, in the fertile plains of Sumer, life continued in its ancient ordered rhythm. In the great city of Ur, the capital of the flourishing Sumerian Empire, merchants guided their barges along the canals, scribes tallied the accounts of the temple storehouses, and the king consulted his priests, all under the watchful gaze of the moon god, Nana, their divine patron. But then, a strange and ominous portent appeared in the sky. A dark, brooding cloud began to gather on the western horizon, drifting slowly, inexorably, towards them. It did not look like a rain cloud, nor a common dust storm from the desert. It was a murky, brownish-black shroud that seemed to swallow the light, and it moved with an unnatural, silent purpose. This was the airborne funeral pyre of Sodom and Gomorrah, the vast invisible cloud of radioactive particles from the nuclear blasts, carried eastward on the prevailing winds. The Sumerian poets who survived the horror would later give it a name. They would call it the evil wind. The wind did not arrive with a gale's fury, but with a stealthy, insidious quiet. It descended upon the cities of Sumer like a ghostly fog, carrying a fine grey, gritty dust that settled into every crevice, coating the leaves of the date palms, the wool of the sheep, and the skin of the people with its impalpable filth. The air, once filled with the familiar smells of river water and hearth smoke, took on a strange, bitter, metallic taste. A great and unnatural silence seemed to fall over the land, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The people looked at the sky in confusion and fear, but their priests had no explanation, and their gods, for the first time, were silent. They did not yet understand that the danger was not in the cloud itself, but in the invisible demons it carried, the slow, creeping death of the poisoned atom. The aftermath was a slow, agonizing slide into oblivion. The first to suffer were the people. A strange and terrible sickness began to spread through the cities, a plague that defied every incantation of the healers. People grew weak and listless, their bodies racked with a fever that would not break. Their hair fell out in clumps, and their mouths and throats became covered in unhealing sores. The invisible poison attacked the very essence of life, unraveling their bodies from the inside out. Then, the land itself began to die. The vibrant, life-giving waters of the Euphrates, now contaminated with the deadly dust, became a vector of death. The lush green fields of barley and wheat that were the pride of Sumer withered and turned black. The cattle in the pastures staggered and fell, their bellies bloated. The very soil was cursed. The great cities of Sumer, the world's first and brightest beacons of civilization, began to transform into vast, silent tombs. The great Sumerian poem, The Lament for Ur, written by a survivor, captures the desolation with heartbreaking clarity. On that day, the storm was joined by a scorching heat. In its streets, where the feasting crowds had milled, scattered potsherds lay. The people, terrified, could hardly breathe. The evil wind clutched them, does not grant them another day. Its weak and its strong, perished with hunger. The Anunnaki, watching the catastrophe unfold from their temples and their skyships, were horrified. This was not supposed to happen. Their surgical strike had turned into an indiscriminate, continental disaster. They had won the battle against Marduk, but in doing so, they had inadvertently poisoned their own most beloved creation, their loyal heartland of Sumer. Their protective technologies could shield them from the worst of the fallout, but they knew the land was now uninhabitable for generations. One by one, in a state of shock and grief, the great gods abandoned their dying cities. Nana and his spouse fled their temple in Ur. The great Enlil himself was forced to abandon his sacred city of Nippur, the very center of his authority on earth. They retreated to the safety of their orbiting vessel, or to their less affected territories, leaving their dying human subjects to face the invisible, incomprehensible plague alone. The golden age of Sumer, the cradle of civilization, did not end with the glorious clash of invading armies. It ended with a quiet, agonizing whimper, suffocated by the lingering, deadly breath of a war that had not even been its own. The evil wind, having done its silent, murderous work, eventually dissipated, but the world it left behind was irrevocably broken. A profound and deathly silence fell over the plains of Sumer. The great cities, which had once been the vibrant, noisy hearts of civilization, were now little more than sprawling necropolises, their grand ziggurats standing as lonely tombstones over a poisoned land. The few survivors, gaunt and grief-stricken, wandered through empty streets, their spirits as barren as the blighted fields around them. But the most terrifying silence was the one that emanated from the heavens. The gods were gone. In the face of a calamity of their own making, the great Anunnaki patrons of Sumer, Enlil, Nana, Ninurta, had fled, abandoning their temples, their cities, and their people. For the first time since the dawn of their consciousness, humanity was utterly and terrifyingly alone, left to choke on the dust of a golden age that had been brought to a sudden, inexplicable, and agonizing end. This was the great power vacuum, a void of leadership and hope in the heart of the civilized world. But the evil wind, for all its destructive breath, had not been universal. Due to the vagaries of celestial mechanics and prevailing winds, the radioactive cloud that had drifted eastward from the Sinai had largely bypassed the lands to the north, along the upper Euphrates. The city of Babylon, Marduk's chosen seat, had been spared. While the holy cities of Enlil's domain were dying, Babylon remained untouched, a small island of life in a sea of desolation. For Marduk, watching the catastrophe unfold from afar, this was not a matter of meteorological luck. It was destiny. It was the ultimate vindication of his cause. When the dust finally settled, he returned to his city, not as a defeated exile, but as a triumphant savior. He presented the miracle of Babylon's survival to the terrified refugees, who began to trickle in from the blighted south as a clear and simple sign. The great gods of Sumer, the Enlilites, had proven powerless to protect their own people from a calamity they themselves had caused. He, Marduk, had protected his followers. He was the only god worthy of their worship, the only leader who could restore order to a shattered world. He opened the granaries of Babylon, which he had wisely kept well stocked, and offered food and clean water to the starving survivors. He offered them shelter, purpose, and most of all, he offered them an explanation for the senseless horror they had endured. It was, he explained, a cosmic war, a final necessary cleansing before a new and better age could begin, an age under his sole authority. And so, in the ashes of Sumer, the age of Marduk began. His first and most brilliant act was not one of conquest with arms, but with words. He understood that to rule the future, he must first rewrite the past. He gathered the scribes and priests of Babylon and dictated to them a new and glorious history of the universe, an epic poem that would supplant all the old Sumerian tales. This was the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation. It was a masterful piece of political and religious propaganda. In his version of events, the great god Enlil was demoted to a minor supporting role. Even the supreme king of Nibiru, Anu himself, was rendered secondary. The hero of the cosmic story, the one who had brought order to the chaos of the early solar system by battling the primeval monster Tiamat, was Marduk. The epic established his preeminence not as a matter of political inheritance, but as a fundamental cosmological fact. He had not seized power. He had earned it at the dawn of time. By defeating Tiamat, he had been granted the Tablet of Destinies by the grateful Council of Gods, making him the supreme and eternal ruler of both heaven and earth. With this new state-sanctioned theology, he erased the contributions of his rivals and elevated himself to the status of a monotheistic deity, with all the other gods reduced to mere aspects or servants of his own divine will. With his divine authority now codified, he set about rebuilding Babylon on a scale of magnificence the world had never seen, ensuring that the physical city would be a worthy reflection of his newfound supremacy. He ordered the reconstruction of the Etemenanki, the great ziggurat that Enlil had destroyed, but this time it was completed without challenge, its shining top a beacon of his power. The city itself was expanded, surrounded by immense, impregnable walls, and graced with majestic processional ways and hanging gardens that would become one of the wonders of the ancient world. Babylon became the new center of the earth, the true gateway of the gods, a cosmopolitan hub of trade, science, and culture that drew people from all the scattered, broken lands. The old Sumerian language, the tongue of the defeated gods, was replaced in official use by the Akkadian dialect of Babylon. The old ways were buried, and a new, centralized, and powerful world order was born. The remaining Anunnaki could do nothing to stop his inexorable rise. The Enlilites were a spent force, their cities poisoned, their followers dead or dispersed, their own hands stained with the sin of the evil wind. Enki, his father, weary of the endless conflict, and perhaps holding a secret paternal pride in his son's audacious triumph, did not stand in his way. Marduk had finally achieved everything he had ever craved. He was the undisputed master of Earth, the king of the gods, his city the center of the universe. He had won the long war, not with a great battle, but with patience, with cunning, and by stepping boldly into the silent, poisoned void his enemies had created. The reign of Marduk, from his magnificent capital of Babylon, ushered in a new and final chapter in the direct governance of Earth by the Anunnaki. For centuries, civilization flourished under his singular centralized authority. Great human kings, the most famous of whom would be Hammurabi, ruled in his name. Their famous law codes presented as transcriptions of the supreme god's own divine will. Under this new order, the old rivalries of the gods seemed to fade into irrelevance. The Enlilites, their power base in Sumer shattered, and their loyal followers decimated by the evil wind, were a spent force. Enlil himself, the great commander, retreated from the affairs of Earth, becoming a distant, brooding figure. His ambitious granddaughter, Inanna, the warrior goddess, found her schemes and conquests checked by Marduk's supreme authority. She remained a powerful regional deity, but her dreams of ruling the world were over, and Enki, Marduk's father, accepted his son's ascendancy with a quiet philosophical grace, content to act as an elder statesman and a keeper of ancient wisdom, while the real power now rested securely in his son's hands. For a time, it seemed that Marduk's ambition had finally brought a lasting, if autocratic, peace to the world. But even as Babylon reached the zenith of its power and glory, a slow, imperceptible change was taking place. A quiet celestial tide that was beginning to turn. The original desperate purpose of the entire Earth mission, the great undertaking that had begun in a time before human memory, was nearing its completion. For millennia, through strife and peace, through creation and destruction, a steady stream of precious, life-giving gold had been shipped from Earth to the orbiting mothership, and from there, on the long voyage home. On Nibiru, the Anunnaki scientists had been painstakingly grinding the metal into the finest monatomic dust and spraying it into their upper atmosphere. And it was working. The planet's thinning atmospheric shield was stabilizing. The slow, cold death of their world had been arrested. The mission was, for all intents and purposes, a success. The existential crisis that had driven them across the solar system was over. With this success, the fundamental reason for their continued large-scale presence on Earth began to evaporate. For the hundreds of rank-and-file Anunnaki, the Igigi who had once toiled in the mines, and the technicians who had maintained the cities, a deep collective homesickness began to set in. Earth was no longer a vital strategic outpost. It was a complex, messy, and increasingly self-sufficient colony whose primary purpose had been fulfilled. They simply wanted to go home. The departure was not a sudden, singular event, not a great exodus of celestial chariots filling the sky. It was a gradual withdrawal, a slow, centuries-long fading of the divine presence. It was a tide going out, so slowly that those living on the shore barely noticed the water level dropping, until one day they looked up and realized the ocean had receded to a distant horizon. At first, the gods simply became less visible. Their physical appearances in the courts of human kings, once a regular occurrence, became rare and momentous events, and then they ceased altogether. The kings who followed were now appointed through complex priestly rituals and omens, their divine mandate a matter of tradition rather than a direct, personal encounter. The gods still spoke, but now only through their chosen high priests, their commands delivered in dreams or whispered prophecies from behind the veil of the temple's innermost sanctum. Then, even these messages grew infrequent, their meaning more obscure. The great temples in Babylon, Thebes, and Uruk, which had been built as the literal physical homes for the gods, slowly transformed. They became symbolic palaces, grand houses, maintained by an ever-growing class of human priests who performed elaborate rituals, not for a present deity, but based on the detailed, inherited memory of one. The gods were slowly, gracefully, transforming from beings of flesh and blood into beings of faith and story. Humanity, the child, was being weaned from its divine parentage, prepared for an age when it would have to stand on its own. One by one, the great figures of the Anunnaki pantheon took their final leave. Enlil, the commander whose authoritarian rule had shaped the earth for so long, his work now done, and his power eclipsed by Marduk, was one of the first of the leaders to make the final journey home to Nibiru. His formidable son, Ninurta, and the grieving mother goddess, Ninhursag, eventually followed. Inanna, her ambitions on Earth now thwarted, left to seek new adventures in other star systems. Enki, the great scientist, the creator, lingered the longest. He felt the deepest bond to the flawed, beautiful creatures he had fashioned, and he stayed for a time as a quiet, unseen guardian, a final, watchful presence, ensuring his children were ready for their independence. Eventually, even he departed, his final legacy the encoded secrets of science and genetics that he left behind with a select few priestly orders. And finally, Marduk himself, the supreme ruler of Earth, prepared for his own departure. Having achieved his every ambition, perhaps he grew weary of his terrestrial kingdom. Or perhaps he was summoned back to Nibiru to account for his actions and take his place in the homeworld's politics. He left his great city and his system of laws as his enduring monument, and he too promised his wailing followers that one day he would return. The great spaceport in the Sinai was ceremonially decommissioned, its vast runways and underground facilities buried beneath the shifting sands. Its purpose served. The age of the gods, the era of direct physical contact between heaven and earth, had finally, quietly, come to an end. Humanity was now alone, left with only the towering, enigmatic stone structures, the half-forgotten stories, and the lingering, instinctive memory of the giants who had once walked among them. A great and profound silence descended upon the earth in the centuries following the final departure of the Anunnaki. The direct, thundering voice of the divine, which had guided, commanded, and terrified humanity for millennia, was gone. In its place was a quiet echo, a lingering memory that was at once a comfort and a source of deep, abiding mystery. Humanity, now entering its adolescence as a species, was left alone in its planetary home, with only the stories and the strange, colossal monuments of its departed parents to contemplate. The central questions that would come to define the human spirit were born in this silence. Where did the great gods go? And will they, as they promised, one day return? In the absence of answers, humanity did what it has always done. It began to remember. And those memories, passed down through generations, polished by poets and codified by priests, slowly transformed from history into myth, from fact into faith. The Anunnaki were no longer physical beings who could be seen and spoken to. They became the archetypes and divine forces that would populate the heavens of 1,000 different cultures. Their legacy was first and most powerfully encoded in the world's religions. As humanity scattered from the shattered unity of Babylon, their languages and cultures diverged, and the names and attributes of their former masters changed with them, like a story whispered from one person to the next, becoming distorted and embellished with each retelling. The core personalities, however, remained strangely intact. The great and terrible Enlil, the stern commander of the heavens, whose word was law and whose wrath was the flood, was remembered as the archetype of the Sky Father. He became Zeus to the Greeks, brandishing his thunderbolt like a divine energy weapon. He was Jupiter to the Romans, the supreme and often unforgiving king of the gods. His brother, the wise Enki, creator of man and master of the waters and of secret knowledge, was fragmented into other figures. He was Poseidon, the lord of the sea. He was Prometheus, the trickster god who defied the ruling power to give a forbidden gift of knowledge to mankind. The dazzling, ambitious, and often dangerous Inanna, goddess of love and war, was reborn as the beautiful Aphrodite and the fierce Athena, her contradictory passions divided into separate, more manageable deities. And the story of Marduk, the rebel son who had overthrown the old order, who had died and been resurrected in some versions of his myth, and who had ascended to become the supreme king of heaven with the promise of a future return, became the most powerful and enduring archetype of all. A template for the savior gods of countless future faiths. The great events of the Anunnaki saga, the creation of man from clay and divine essence, the great world-destroying flood survived by a single chosen family, The bitter wars between the gods that shook the heavens became the foundational myths of nearly every civilization on the planet. A shared, collective memory that hinted at a single, forgotten source. The second great echo of their presence was written not in words, but in stone. All across the globe, humanity was left with colossal, enigmatic structures that seemed to defy the logic of the primitive ages that followed. The Great Pyramids at Giza, their original purpose as celestial beacons for the Sinai spaceport, now forgotten, were reinterpreted as the tombs of human kings. Their impossible mathematical precision and astronomical alignments, a mystery that baffled generations who came after. In the mountains of Lebanon, the foundation of a great temple at a place called Baalbek rested on a podium of stone blocks, some weighing over 1,000 tons, cut and placed with a precision that modern machinery would struggle to replicate. In the high Andes of South America, the ruins of Pumapunku lay scattered like a child's discarded toys, its intricate stone blocks, cut with laser-like edges, and complex interlocking joints that seemed more machine-made than hand-carved. These and 100 other megalithic sites stood as a silent global testament to a lost age of impossible technology. Later civilizations, having lost the knowledge of their true origin, could only look upon these works with awe and attribute them to the power of giants, magicians, or the gods themselves, never suspecting that they were simply the leftover construction projects of their former masters. And finally, their legacy whispered from the cryptic verses of ancient texts, the memories of their technology preserved in the language of miracle and magic. The devastating power of the 7 weapons of terror that had laid waste to the cities of the plain was no longer understood as nuclear fission, but was remembered as a rain of divine fire and brimstone. The sleek, silent skyships of the Anunnaki were forgotten as physical craft and were transformed into the fiery chariots that carried prophets like Elijah into the heavens, or the fabulous jewel-encrusted Vimanas described in the Hindu Vedas, flying palaces that waged complex aerial battles in the sky. The genetic engineering in the House of Life became a story of a god breathing life into a figure of clay. The Anunnaki themselves, once tangible rulers and commanders, became the angels of the Bible, divine messengers who looked like men, who ate and drank with mortals, and who sometimes delivered tidings of great joy, and at other times stark warnings of terrible impending doom. The entire sprawling and unbelievable history of the Anunnaki on Earth was not lost. It was simply hidden in plain sight, fragmented and encoded within the sacred myths, the impossible stone ruins, and the holy books of the very creatures they had created and abandoned. The past was not dead. It was merely sleeping, waiting for a future generation of humanity, a generation that had rediscovered space travel, genetics, and weapons of mass destruction for itself, to finally find the key, to reread the ancient stories, and to recognize the faces of their long-departed creators. The departure of the Anunnaki left a God-shaped void in the human psyche, and for millennia, humanity filled that void with the echoes of their memory. The stories of their creators were woven into the rich tapestries of myth and religion. Their colossal structures were pondered by philosophers, and their laws became the bedrock of fledgling empires. But as humanity grew and its own civilizations rose and fell, the age of Babylon giving way to Persia, then to the logical precision of Greece and the unstoppable might of Rome, A new way of understanding the universe began to emerge. The heavens, once seen as a celestial canvas for divine drama, were slowly reinterpreted as a great, intricate machine, a clockwork of predictable orbits and physical laws. Science was born, and in its bright empirical light, the old myths were dismissed as the fanciful superstitions of a primitive, unenlightened age. The stories of gods who descended from the sky in fiery chariots were filed away as poetry, not history. Humanity, proud of its newfound reason, believed it had finally put away its childish things. And yet, deep within the very science that sought to dispel the myths, a strange and familiar echo was about to be heard. The hunt began not for a mythical world, but with a simple, scientific observation. In the late 18th century, the discovery of the planet Uranus gave humanity its first new view of the solar system since antiquity. But as astronomers tracked this new, distant world, they noticed it wasn't behaving properly. It wobbled and strayed in its orbit, as if being tugged by the gravity of something unseen, something even further out in the darkness. This gravitational ghost led mathematicians to predict the existence of yet another planet. And in 1846, telescopes were pointed to that precise spot in the sky, and the planet Neptune was found. It was a stunning triumph of Newtonian physics, a confirmation that the universe was indeed a place of sublime mathematical order. But even after accounting for Neptune, some anomalies remained. A new generation of astronomers, convinced there was still a planet X lurking in the outer darkness, continued the hunt. This search led to the discovery of Pluto in 1930. But Pluto was far too small to be the gravitational bully they were looking for. The mystery endured, a quiet, persistent whisper at the edge of the known solar system. It was into this scientific landscape that a new and radical interpretation of the past was introduced. In the mid-20th century, while astronomers were scanning the heavens, a scholar named Zechariah Sitchin was hunched over the baked clay tablets of ancient Sumer. He argued that the cuneiform script, when translated with a fresh and literal eye, did not tell stories of mythological gods and allegorical heavens. Instead, he claimed, they were detailed historical and scientific records. And the most astonishing of these records was a complete and sophisticated cosmology of our solar system. The Sumerians, he contended, knew of all the planets from Mercury to Pluto, but their celestial map contained one extra dramatic member, a 12th body, counting the sun and moon, which they called Nibiru, the planet of the crossing. According to these ancient texts, Nibiru was not a local god, but a physical planet, the homeworld of the Anunnaki, and it moved in a vast 3,600-year elliptical orbit that brought it swinging through the inner solar system between Mars and Jupiter before flinging it back out into the cosmic darkness. For decades, this theory was the very definition of fringe science, ridiculed by mainstream academia as a fantastical misreading of ancient myth. The idea of a massive, undiscovered planet in our own solar system was deemed impossible. Then, in the early years of the 21st century, something remarkable happened. Two astronomers at Caltech, Mike Brown and Konstantin Batygin, were studying a group of extremely distant, icy objects out beyond Neptune in a region called the Kuiper Belt. They noticed something deeply strange. The orbits of these scattered, unrelated objects were all mysteriously aligned, clustered together, as if they were being shepherded by an invisible hand. They ran the computer simulations, and the math pointed to only one plausible explanation: the gravitational influence of a huge, unseen planet, a world perhaps 10 times the mass of Earth, lurking in the outer darkness on a long, strange, elliptical orbit. The scientific world was electrified. The hunt for Planet X was on again, but this time with compelling, modern mathematical evidence. They called their theoretical world Planet 9. Oh, and in that moment, two seemingly unrelated stories, an ancient myth from a dead civilization and a cutting-edge astronomical theory, collided with the force of a revelation. The planet that modern science was now seriously hunting for, a massive world on a vast elliptical orbit, sounded uncannily like the Nibiru described on 6,000-year-old Sumerian tablets. The search is now underway. Great telescopes on the mountaintops of Hawaii and Chile are methodically scanning the predicted orbital paths, hunting for a faint, slow-moving point of light against the backdrop of distant stars. New observatories, like the Vera C. Rubin Observatory, are coming online with the power to map the entire sky with a precision never before imagined, and many astronomers believe it is only a matter of years, or even months, before Planet 9 is finally found. And so, the great story has come full circle. The narrative that began with the Anunnaki leaving their fading, distant homeworld has found its final chapter in the patient, methodical work of modern astronomers. The line between myth and science has become impossibly, tantalizingly blurred. Humanity is once again looking to the heavens for a lost member of our solar family, and we are left with a profound and unsettling question, hanging in the cold, silent darkness of space. Are we about to discover a new ninth planet? Or are we, after all this time, finally about to find the first verifiable footprint of the gods who promised they would one day return? And so our long, strange, and epic tale draws to a quiet close. Its final chapter, written not on ancient clay tablets or in the secret councils of the gods, but in the patient, searching gaze of our own modern telescopes. The search for a hidden world at the edge of our solar system has, in a way, brought the story of the Anunnaki home, transforming it from a half-forgotten myth into a tangible, scientific quest. But whether that quest ends with the discovery of a simple, barren planet of rock and ice, or with the validation of an impossible, ancient history, the true, enduring legacy of the Anunnaki may not be a physical planet at all. Their most powerful and lasting footprint may be the story itself, a story that has echoed through our religions, our architecture, and our collective unconscious. A grand, overarching narrative for the human condition. For what is this story, in the end, if not a mirror for ourselves? Perhaps the Anunnaki were never tall, pale beings from a distant world. Perhaps they are the names we have given to the warring, divine forces within our own complex nature. We are all, are we not, a fusion of the ingenious, creative, and sometimes reckless spirit of Enki, and the rigid, disciplined, and often tyrannical spirit of Enlil. We build and we create with a furious, inspired passion. And then we seek to control that creation with laws, with borders, and with force. We contain within us the burning, insatiable ambition of a Marduk, seeking to elevate ourselves and our own tribe above all others, and the dazzling, dangerous passions of an Inanna who wages war for the same reasons she loves, completely and with a terrifying intensity. The story of our creation in their image becomes a profound metaphor for our own duality. We are Adamu, the creature of the earth, our feet planted firmly in the mud of our biology, but we are also imprinted with a divine spark, a whisper of the celestial that causes us to forever gaze up at the stars and wonder where we came from. Viewed through this lens, their story becomes our own. The expulsion from the perfect walled garden of the Eden is the universal human story of the painful, shocking, but necessary transition from the innocence of childhood to the difficult self-awareness of adulthood. The Great Flood is not just a single historical event, but the recurring archetype of destruction and rebirth, the personal and collective catastrophes that scour our lives clean, forcing us to rebuild from the wreckage with only a handful of cherished survivors and the seeds of a new future. The Tower of Babel is the timeless tragedy of our own hubris, our tendency to let our ambition outstrip our wisdom, leading to the confusion and conflict that scatters us and divides us against ourselves. The gods' gradual departure becomes a bittersweet allegory for growing up, the slow, quiet withdrawal of our parents, leaving us feeling at once liberated and profoundly abandoned, alone on the world stage, armed with their lessons, but now responsible for our own destiny. And yet, the mysteries remain. The universe is far stranger and more ancient than our young science can comprehend, and our own past is a country of deep, alluring shadows. The stones of Baalbek and Pumapunku remain stubbornly, impossibly large. The sudden, explosive flowering of civilization in ancient Sumer remains an academic puzzle. The great, global myth of a devastating flood is a statistical anomaly that is difficult to dismiss, and the strange, clustered orbits of those distant icy worlds continue to whisper of a great, unseen shepherd in the dark. The power of the Anunnaki story, the reason it continues to fascinate us, is that it lives in the fertile, imaginative space between the myth and the machine, between the poem and the printout. It does not demand that we abandon our reason, only that we expand our sense of the possible. It gives us a new and strangely beautiful language to frame the oldest and most profound questions of our species. Are we alone in the universe? What is the true source of the divine spark we feel within us? And what is the meaning of the countless cryptic clues that our own ancestors left for us? Clues that seem to point to a past far grander and far stranger than we have ever allowed ourselves to believe. Ultimately, it is just a story for the stars, but it is one of the grandest we have ever told ourselves. And as you rest now, as the world outside grows quiet and the stars begin their silent nightly passage, perhaps it is a good story to carry with you into the gentle country of sleep. A story that reminds us that the world is a place of deep mystery, that our own past is not a closed book, and that our future is not yet written. The search for answers continues, both in the deep recesses of space and in the quiet depths of the human heart. But for tonight, the search is over. The long tale has been told. Reassure yourself that all is well. The past is a quiet and distant shore. The final imagery fades to the soft silver light of the moon on your window, and the only sound is your own calm, steady breathing. And now, it's time to rest. Sleep well.